Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the quietest stories are often the ones that carried the heaviest weight. Imagine standing at the edge of a river you cannot follow. The water moves fast and brown and purposeful, and then it simply disappears. Not around a bend exactly, but down, into a crack in the earth so deep and so wide that the walls on either side swallow the light before it can reach the bottom. You can hear the river long after you can no longer see it. A low, constant roar rising up from somewhere below, like the sound of something very large breathing. You do not know how far down it goes. You do not know what the water does once it gets there. You do not know if anyone who goes in comes back out. In 1869, that was not a metaphor. That was a genuine geographic fact. The Colorado River as it passed through the canyon country of the American Southwest was, in the most literal sense, unknown. Not poorly understood, not roughly sketched. Unknown. The last significant blank on the map of the continental United States. Tonight we're going to follow the people who went into that blank. And we're going to start with the man who led them. A one-armed geology professor from Illinois named John Wesley Powell, who was 35 years old, who had no money to speak of, who had borrowed most of his instruments, and who had assembled a crew of 9 men in wooden boats to go somewhere no one had successfully returned from with a complete account. Before we get into any of that, I want to ask you something small. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you lying in bed with the lights low, somewhere familiar and warm? Maybe you are driving a long empty road at night, or sitting by a window with something warm in your hands. Whatever time it is, whatever the temperature is outside, I am glad you are here. Stories like this one are worth settling in for. They take a little time to tell properly, and if you enjoy what we do here at Life Beyond Seen, the slow, careful kind of storytelling, the kind that takes history seriously and treats it like something worth actually understanding, then a like on this video and a subscription to the channel means more than you might think. It helps other people find their way here. It keeps the lights on in the gentlest possible sense. So if you feel moved to do that at any point, please do. And now, let us go back to 1869. The Colorado River in the years just after the Civil War was one of the most discussed and least understood geographic features in North America. Explorers had approached it from the south and from the west. Army surveyors had mapped its upper reaches and its lower mouth. Trappers and prospectors had stood at its rim and looked down. A few parties had attempted short stretches of the river from the canyon's edges, but the interior, the long continuous descent through the canyon system of the Colorado Plateau, had never been fully navigated. Not by any documented American or European expedition. There were rumours, of course. There were always rumours. Some accounts circulating in the 1860s suggested the river eventually passed beneath a mountain, flowing underground for miles before re-emerging. Others held that there were falls somewhere in the canyon, so enormous they would destroy any craft that reached them. One idea, repeated often enough that it had a kind of casual authority, was that the river simply dropped away into the earth somewhere in the interior and did not come out the other side. None of these ideas were true, but none of them could be disproved either. That is what it means for a place to be genuinely unknown. The imagination fills the space that information has not yet reached. John Wesley Powell was the kind of man who found that situation intolerable in the best possible way. Not intolerable as in frightening. Intolerable as in unacceptable. A problem that needed to be solved. He was a geologist, or at least he was becoming one. He was also a teacher, a veteran, a self-taught naturalist, and a man who had spent most of his adult life doing things in boats, and on foot, that most people would have considered inadvisable. The missing arm was, depending on how you look at it, either the most remarkable thing about him or the least. It was remarkable because of how he lost it and what he did afterward. It was the least remarkable thing about him because it seemed to slow him down almost not at all. He lost the arm at the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862. Powell was serving as a Union artillery officer, and during the fighting along the Tennessee River, he was struck by a Minie ball, a conical lead bullet, that shattered the bones of his right forearm so severely that the arm had to be amputated just below the elbow. He was 28 years old. He was back commanding artillery units within months. He fought at Vicksburg. He was present at the siege of Atlanta. He finished the war as a brevet lieutenant colonel, and he did all of this with one arm and with what his colleagues described as a remarkably steady disposition. The pain from the amputation, it is worth noting, never fully went away. He experienced what we would now call phantom limb pain for the rest of his life. He did not talk about it much. By 1867, he was teaching geology and natural history at Illinois Wesleyan University, and then at Illinois State Normal University, and he had begun organizing summer expeditions to the Rocky Mountains, partly for scientific purposes, partly because he could not seem to stop moving. He took students with him. He took his wife, Emma Dean, with him on the 1867 trip, which gives you some sense of how he thought about risk. In 1868, he led a larger expedition to the White River country of Colorado and spent time among the Ute people, learning some of their language and geography. It was during this period that the idea for the Colorado River descent began to take real shape. He had been studying the river from above, from the canyon rims, reading the exposed rock layers, trying to understand the geological history of the plateau. And at some point, the only logical next step, at least to Powell, was to go down into it. Getting support for the expedition was not simple. Powell was not wealthy. He was not famous. He was a one-armed professor at a small Illinois college with a habit of going on expensive summer trips. He approached the Smithsonian Institution, and he approached the Chicago Academy of Sciences, and he managed to secure scientific instruments, sextants, barometers, chronometers, thermometers, along with some rations and a letter of support. What he did not secure was significant funding. The US Army helped him obtain surplus rations. He got permission to draw on Army provisions at various posts along the route. He collected small donations. The whole operation was put together on something close to nothing, which is worth keeping in mind when you consider what it eventually produced. The crew he assembled was a varied group, 9 men in total, including Powell himself. His brother Walter Powell came along, a fellow Civil War veteran who had spent time as a Confederate prisoner of war, and who was, by 1869, not entirely well in ways that would become more apparent as the journey progressed. There was Jack Sumner, a trapper and mountain man who had been with Powell on the Rocky Mountain expeditions, and who was probably the most experienced wilderness traveller in the group. There was George Bradley, a former Army sergeant who kept a detailed diary throughout the journey, one of the most valuable records we have of what actually happened. There was Oromel Howland, a printer and outdoorsman from Colorado, and his younger brother Seneca Howland. There was Bill Dunn, another experienced trapper. There was Frank Goodman, an Englishman who had reportedly signed on because he was looking for adventure, which is both understandable and, in retrospect, a mild understatement of what he was going to find. And there was Andy Hall, who was 18 years old at the time of the expedition. The youngest member of the crew, a Scottish-born young man who had already spent several years on the frontier, and who seems to have approached the whole enterprise with a degree of cheerfulness that the rest of the crew probably found either comforting or mildly baffling. These were the people who were going to attempt the first complete navigation of the Colorado River through the canyon system. They were not a specially trained elite unit. They were not funded by a government with serious resources behind them. They were 9 men, 8 of them, if you want to be precise about the arm count, in 4 wooden boats with borrowed instruments and army surplus bacon, about to go somewhere the map simply stopped. The river they were going to enter had been described in fragments by various parties over the years, but no coherent picture existed. Army Lieutenant Joseph Ives had travelled up the lower Colorado by steamboat in 1857 and 1858, and had reached the lower end of the Grand Canyon, but he had not gone further. He famously wrote afterward that the region was, quote, altogether valueless, and that his party was probably the last group of Americans who would ever visit the locality. He was wrong on both counts, but the sentiment captures something about how the canyon country was perceived at the time, as a barrier, an obstacle, a place that existed mainly to make travel difficult. Powell saw it differently. He saw it as a record a library of geological time written in stone, waiting to be read by someone willing to go inside it. That is what makes the 1869 expedition interesting in a way that goes beyond simple adventure. Powell was not going into the canyon only to cross it. He was going in to understand it. He was going in with instruments and notebooks and a geologist's eye, and he intended to come out with knowledge. The fact that he had one arm and almost no money and a crew assembled largely from veterans and frontier men, and one enthusiastic teenager, that was just the practical reality of the situation. He worked with what he had, and in the spring of 1869, what he had was ready. The boats were built, the supplies were loaded, the crew was gathered at Green River City in the Wyoming Territory, which was less a city than a rough railroad town that existed because the Transcontinental Railroad had recently passed through it. The Union Pacific tracks crossed the Green River there, and it was as good a launching point as any. The Green River being a major tributary of the Colorado, and the logical place to begin the descent. A small crowd of onlookers gathered to watch them go. Some of them, almost certainly, did not expect to see these men again. Powell stood at the bow of the Emma Dean, the small 16-foot pine boat that was his personal craft named after his wife, and the river was running high and fast from the spring snowmelt coming off the Rockies. The water was cold and moving quickly, and the canyon walls ahead were already beginning to rise on either side, pale and layered and enormous in the morning light. What those walls would tell him, and what the river would demand of all of them, is where this story really begins. But before we follow the river, it is worth staying with Powell himself for a little longer, because the man who stood at the bow of that small pine boat on the morning of May 24th, 1869, was not someone who had arrived at this moment by accident. He had been moving toward it, in one way or another, for most of his adult life. And understanding who he was before the expedition helps explain how he managed to hold it together once the canyon walls closed in around them. John Wesley Powell was born in Mount Morris, New York in 1834, the son of a Methodist preacher named Joseph Powell, who moved his family frequently, first to Ohio, then to Wisconsin, then to Illinois. Following congregations and opportunities as they came, it was not a wealthy household. It was not a particularly settled one. Powell grew up in a series of small frontier towns, at a time when the American Midwest was still being shaped, still being cleared and ploughed and argued over, and the natural world was right there at the edge of every settlement, enormous and largely unexamined. He seems to have noticed it early. As a boy, he collected shells and fossils and plant specimens with the kind of focused enthusiasm that tends to either become a lifelong passion or burn itself out before adolescence. In Powell's case, it became a lifelong passion. He had no formal scientific training to speak of, at least not in the beginning. He taught himself, he read whatever he could find. He corresponded with naturalists and geologists whose work he admired. He joined the Illinois Natural History Society and the Ohio Natural History Society, attending meetings and contributing specimens and slowly building a network of people who took the natural world seriously. This was how science often worked in mid-19th century America, not through universities and laboratories so much as through networks of curious, self-motivated individuals who wrote letters and collected things and compared notes. Powell fit that world well. He had the energy for it, and the patience for it, and importantly, the willingness to go outside and actually look at things rather than just reading about them. The Mississippi River Walk is one of those biographical details that tends to get mentioned briefly and then passed over, but it deserves a moment. In 1855, when Powell was 21 years old, he walked the entire length of the Mississippi River, the whole thing, from its headwaters in northern Minnesota down to the Gulf of Mexico. He was collecting natural history specimens as he went, making observations, taking notes. This was not a casual summer hike. The Mississippi in 1855 was a working river, loud, industrial, crowded with steamboats and flatboats and rafts of timber. but along its banks there was still a great deal of wild country, and Powell was interested in all of it. The walk took months. He did it largely alone, and what it gave him, beyond the specimens and the notebooks, was a physical understanding of what a river actually does, how it moves, how it shapes the land around it, how the geology changes as you travel downstream, how the character of a river is not a fixed thing but something that shifts continuously with the terrain it is cutting through. He rode rivers too in those years before the war. The Ohio, the Illinois, the Des Moines. Powell made solo or small party trips down each of them in small open boats, sometimes collecting specimens, sometimes just travelling, always paying attention. These were not trivial undertakings. Rivers in the 1850s were not recreational amenities. They were working corridors that could turn dangerous quickly, and travelling them in a small boat required skill and judgment, and a willingness to deal with whatever the water presented. Powell was building that skill set long before anyone had heard of the Colorado River, long before the Grand Canyon was anything more than a rumour carried back by occasional travellers from the Southwest. When the Civil War came, Powell enlisted. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 20th Illinois Infantry and rose through the ranks steadily, eventually commanding an artillery battery. He was at Fort Donelson in February 1862, one of the early major Union victories of the war, and then at Shiloh in April of that same year. Shiloh was a catastrophe by almost any measure. 2 days of brutal fighting in the Tennessee woods that left nearly 24,000 men killed, wounded, or missing between both sides. Powell was hit in the right wrist by a rifle ball on the first day. He kept fighting. The wound did not look survivable in the way wounds were assessed in 1862, and the surgeons who examined it agreed. The arm had to come off. He was 27 years old. He lost the arm below the elbow, which meant he retained some of the upper arm's function, though the stump would cause him pain for the rest of his life. Phantom pain, nerve pain, the ordinary misery of an amputation wound in an era before modern medicine had much to offer for it. What is remarkable is what came after. Powell did not leave the army. He did not go home to recover and quietly stepped back from public life, which would have been entirely understandable. He went back to his artillery command. He fought at Champion Hill, at the Siege of Vicksburg, at Nashville. He rose to the rank of brevet lieutenant colonel. He learned to manage a one-armed life with a kind of practical determination that seems to have characterized everything he did, not pretending the limitation did not exist, but not allowing it to define the boundaries of what he attempted either. His wife Emma came to be with him in the field for portions of the war, which was not entirely unusual for officers' wives at the time, and she helped him in practical ways with the tasks that were genuinely difficult with one arm. They were, by all accounts, a close partnership. After the war, Powell took a teaching position at Illinois Wesleyan University, and later at Illinois State Normal University, where he taught geology and natural history. He was not a conventional academic. He organised field trips. He took students out into the countryside to look at rocks and collect specimens, and understand the landscape as a physical record rather than just a backdrop. He rebuilt his natural history collections, which had been largely lost or dispersed during the war, and he worked to establish the Illinois Natural History Museum. He was busy, and he was building towards something, though it probably would not have looked that way from the outside. The Rocky Mountain expeditions of 1867 and 1868 are where the Colorado idea really took shape. Powell led groups of students and naturalists out to Colorado in both years, climbing peaks, collecting specimens, studying geology, camping in the high country. On the 1868 trip, the party wintered in the White River Valley in Colorado, and Powell spent months talking to Ute people in the region and learning what he could about the country to the south. He heard descriptions of the Great Canyon. He heard about the river that disappeared into the earth and ran through depths that no one had fully mapped. He began to think seriously about going in. He also began, during those Rocky Mountain years, to understand something about the geology of the Colorado Plateau that would shape everything that followed. The region was not just dramatic landscape. It was a record, a layered, readable record of geological time that was exposed in a way almost nowhere else on Earth was exposed, because the Colorado River and its tributaries had been cutting downward through horizontal rock layers for millions of years, leaving those layers visible in the canyon walls like pages of a book left open. Powell understood this in a way that most people looking at the canyon did not. Where others saw an obstacle or a wonder, he saw a scientific instrument. He wanted to read it. Convincing the Smithsonian Institution to support the expedition was a matter of presenting himself as a serious scientific investigator, which he was, and promising systematic results, which he intended to deliver. The Smithsonian provided instruments, barometers, chronometers, sextants, thermometers, and a letter of endorsement that helped him secure other support. The Chicago Academy of Sciences contributed as well. The US Army provided surplus rations through a provision that allowed scientific expeditions to draw on military stores. None of this added up to a well-funded operation. Powell was essentially scraping together support from multiple small sources and making it work through persistence and the force of a genuinely compelling proposal. He was going to map the last unmapped river in the continental United States. He was going to bring back geological records of a canyon system that no one had systematically studied. That was the pitch, and it was enough. The crew he assembled reflected his resources and his connections more than any ideal of expedition composition. Jack Sumner he knew from the Rocky Mountain trips. Sumner ran a trading post in Middle Park, Colorado, and was one of the most capable wilderness men Powell had encountered. He trusted Sumner's judgment in the field. George Bradley came through a somewhat unusual arrangement. Powell approached the army and asked if there were any soldiers who wanted to be discharged from service in exchange for joining the expedition, and Bradley, who was stationed at Fort Bridger and apparently eager to be done with military life, agreed. He was a careful, observant man, and his diary would turn out to be one of the most important records of the journey. Oromel Howland, the printer from Colorado, brought his younger brother Seneca along. Frank Goodman, the Englishman, came with enthusiasm and perhaps insufficient information about what he was signing up for. Bill Dunn was another frontier man with experience in the mountain country. Walter Powell, John's brother, was a more complicated presence. He had survived a brutal stretch as a Confederate prisoner of war, and the experience had left marks on him that would become more visible under pressure. And Andy Hall, 18 years old, Scottish-born, already a frontier veteran of sorts, seems to have brought a lightness to the group that the others, weighted down by war and hard years, probably needed. 9 men, 4 boats, borrowed instruments and army surplus provisions, and a one-armed geologist who had spent 20 years teaching himself to read the natural world and was now about to enter the largest geological classroom on the continent. The boats themselves were not improvised. Powell had thought carefully about what would be needed. 3 of them were 21-foot oak pilot boats, heavy and sturdy, built to handle rough water. The 4th was the Emma Dean, Powell's own craft, 16 feet long, made of light pine, designed for speed and maneuverability rather than cargo capacity. She sat higher in the water and handled more quickly, which made her useful for scouting ahead of the heavier boats. The total weight of supplies loaded into all 4 was somewhere around 10,000 pounds. Flour, bacon, dried apples, coffee, beans, and the scientific instruments, carefully packed and wrapped against water damage. The instruments were, in some ways, the most important cargo Powell was carrying. The whole point of the expedition, from his perspective, was not just to get through, but to measure and record and understand. The barometers in particular were critical, because altitude readings taken at various points along the river would allow him to calculate how much the river was dropping, how much descent remained, how much canyon wall was above them at any given moment. Those numbers would matter more and more as the journey went on. The Green River was running high on the morning of launch. The snowmelt from the Rockies had swelled it, and the current was fast and cold and brown with sediment. The crowd that gathered to watch them go was not enormous. Green River City was a rough railroad town, not a metropolis, but there were enough people there to make it feel like a departure, which it was. Powell took the bow of the Emma Dean. The other boats were loaded and crewed. The river moved past them indifferent and fast, heading south toward country that none of them had seen. Whatever the onlookers thought as the boats pulled away from the bank, and some of them surely thought these men were heading toward their deaths, the river did not wait for anyone's opinion about it. It simply moved, as it had been moving for millions of years, cutting its way south and west through the rock, carrying the snowmelt of the Rockies toward the desert. And Powell and his 8 companions went with it, into the current, into the canyon walls that were already beginning to rise on either side, into the first days of a journey that would take them places no one had ever recorded in any systematic way. The early miles were deceptive. The river was fast but manageable. The walls were striking but not yet overwhelming. There was almost a lightness to it those first days. The relief of finally being underway, the pleasure of moving through open country under a wide sky. But the Green River was leading them south, and the canyon country was waiting, and the first real test of what they were actually dealing with was not far ahead. The date was May 24th, 1869. Green River City, Wyoming Territory, a rough windswept settlement that had sprung up along the Transcontinental Railroad line, the kind of place that existed mainly because the Union Pacific needed a water stop and the surrounding country needed somewhere to sell things. It was not a romantic starting point. There were saloons, a few wooden storefronts, mud in the streets when it rained, and a general atmosphere of transience that characterized most railroad towns of that era. But the Green River ran through it, wide and fast and cold, and that was all Powell needed. The 4 boats had been built to his specifications and shipped out by rail. 3 of them were 21-foot oak pilot boats, heavy, double-ribbed, designed for rough water and serious cargo. They were not elegant. They were workhorses built to take punishment, and they would need to be. Powell had named them the Maid of the Canyon, Kitty Clyde's sister, and the No Name. The No Name, it should be said, was not named with any particular foresight about what would happen to it later. It was simply the name that stuck when no better one was agreed upon. The 4th boat was different in character. The Emma Dean, 16 feet long, built from lighter pine, sitting higher in the water and responding more quickly to the oars. Powell had named her after his wife. She was designed to run ahead of the heavier boats, scouting the water, signalling back what lay around the next bend. In the logic of the expedition, she was the eyes of the group. Powell would ride in her bow, watching the river ahead, making decisions. Loading the boats took time and care. The total weight of supplies came to somewhere around 10,000 pounds, which is a number worth sitting with for a moment. 10,000 pounds distributed across 4 wooden boats, to be carried down a river that no one had navigated in its entirety, through canyons that appeared on no reliable map. The supplies were practical and unglamorous. Sacks of flour, sides of bacon, dried apples, coffee, beans. These were the staples of frontier travel, chosen for caloric density and shelf life rather than variety or pleasure. There were also the scientific instruments, wrapped and packed with considerably more care than the bacon. 2 barometers, several chronometers, sextants, thermometers, a collection of compasses. These were not backups or duplicates of each other. Each instrument served a specific function in Powell's plan to measure and record the canyon system as they passed through it. The barometers in particular were essential. By taking air pressure readings at different points along the river and comparing them against readings taken at known elevations, Powell could calculate altitude with reasonable accuracy. That would tell him how high the canyon walls were above him, how much the river dropped, and, critically, how much descent remained before they reached the lower river where the canyon opened out. He was not just travelling, he was measuring. The instruments were the difference between an adventure and an expedition. The crew assembled on the bank that morning made for an interesting group to look at. Jack Sumner, lean and competent, a man who had spent years in the mountain country and knew how to move through difficult terrain without drama. George Bradley, the former soldier, quiet and observant, the kind of man who keeps notes. Orimal Howland, the printer, a bit older than some of the others, with his younger brother Seneca beside him. Frank Goodman, the Englishman, whose enthusiasm for the venture was genuine, if perhaps not fully informed by what the venture actually involved. Bill Dunn, another experienced frontier man, comfortable with hard country. Walter Powell, John's older brother, a big man, quieter than you might expect, carrying something heavy from his years as a prisoner of war that had not fully resolved itself. And Andy Hall, 18 years old, Scottish-born, already a veteran of enough frontier experience to hold his own, and apparently possessed of a cheerfulness that the others, who had mostly seen too much of the war, found either refreshing or baffling depending on the day. 9 men in total, including Powell. They ranged from 18 to 35. Most of them had served in the Civil War in some capacity. Most of them had spent time in a rough country before this. None of them had done anything quite like what they were about to do, and most of them knew it. The crowd that gathered to watch the launch was not enormous, but it was real. Green River City was small, but word had gotten around that something unusual was happening at the riverbank that morning. People came to watch. Some of them, by most accounts, were not entirely convinced they were watching a departure so much as a farewell. The Colorado River below the canyon had a reputation, not a documented reputation, not one built on careful accounts, but the kind of reputation that accumulates from rumour and silence. Men had gone in. Accounts had not come back. There were stories, vague and unverifiable, of waterfalls that dropped into underground chambers, of sections of river that simply vanished beneath the rock. These stories were almost certainly wrong, but in the absence of anyone who had come back with a complete record, they filled the space that knowledge had not yet occupied. Powell stood at the bow of the Emma Dean. One arm, 35 years old. The river was running fast and brown with snowmelt from the Rockies, higher than its usual spring level, muscular and cold. He had spent years preparing for this moment, not in any single-minded obsessive way, but in the way that a person who is genuinely curious about the world gradually finds themselves pointed toward the one question that pulls everything else together. The canyon system of the Colorado was that question for Powell. What was down there? What the rocks would show him? What it would be possible to know? The boats pushed off. The current took them. The crowd on the bank fell behind. The river moved south as it always had, cutting through the high desert country of Wyoming toward the canyon lands of Utah, carrying the snowmelt of the mountains toward the sea. The walls on either side were still low in those first miles, the country still open, the sky still wide. There was almost a feeling of release to it, the long months of planning and persuading and preparing, finally giving way to the simple fact of moving. The Emma Dean handled well. Powell had chosen the design carefully, and the boat responded to the current with a quickness that the heavier oak boats behind him did not have. He could feel the river through the hull, its speed, its depth, the way the current shifted and braided across the channel. These were things he had learned to read over years of river travel, on the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Illinois, the Des Moines. He was not new to rivers, but this river was different in scale and character from anything he had encountered before, and he knew it. The first few days were, by the accounts of those who kept records, something close to pleasant. The water was fast but not violent. The scenery was striking, the red and tan bluffs of the Wyoming basin giving way gradually to more dramatic formations as they moved south. The crew settled into the rhythms of river travel. The early starts, the long hours on the water, the camps on sandbars or gravel beaches in the evening. Andy Hall apparently sang. George Bradley made notes. Sumner watched the water with professional attention. Powell used every available moment for observation. Even in those early miles, he was recording the rock formations on the canyon walls, noting the strata, sketching outlines in his journal. He had a particular way of looking at landscape that most people around him probably did not fully share. Not just seeing what was in front of him, but reading it, asking what it meant, what process had produced it, how long that process had taken. A cliff face to Powell was not just a cliff face, it was a record. It was time made visible in stone. He had been trained to see that way, first by his own self-directed reading, and then by years of field work, and the canyon country of the Colorado was going to give him more to read than almost any place on Earth. The river entered the canyon country of Utah gradually. The walls began to rise. The sky above them narrowed. The sound of the water changed as the channel tightened, becoming more concentrated, more present. They were moving into it now, into the system of canyons that Powell had been thinking about for years, and the canyon was beginning to show them what it was. The boats were carrying more weight than was ideal for rough water. 10,000 pounds of supplies and instruments distributed across 4 boats meant that the heavier oak boats in particular sat deep in the water, which made them slower to respond and harder to maneuver in a fast current. Powell knew this. He had made the calculation that the supplies were necessary and that the boats could handle the weight, but it was the kind of calculation that the river would eventually test against its own opinion. The river's opinion, as it turned out, would be delivered with some force in the days ahead. The Green River moved through Flaming Gorge first, a stretch of red canyon walls that Powell would later name, finding in the colour of the stone something worth marking. The walls here were a deep brownish red, almost burnt-looking in the afternoon light, and the canyon was narrow enough that the sky above was just a strip of blue. It was beautiful in the way that confined, dramatic places can be beautiful. A beauty that has a slight edge of pressure to it, because the walls are close and the river is moving and there is not much room to do anything but go forward. Below Flaming Gorge, the river entered Lodore Canyon, and Lodore was a different matter entirely. The walls of Lodore rose steeply, dark and close, and the river in that canyon was not the manageable fast water of the first days. It was loud. The sound of rapids carried around bends before the rapids themselves were visible, a low continuous roar that told you something significant was happening downstream before you could see it. Powell's procedure in these situations was careful and methodical. Bring the boats to shore, climb above the rapid if possible, study the water, make a decision. Run it, line the boats through with ropes from the bank or portage, carry everything around overland. Each choice had its costs. Running a dangerous rapid risked the boats and the men. Lining was slow and exhausting. Portaging in a canyon where the walls came down to the water's edge was sometimes nearly impossible. They were 5 days out from Green River City when the no-name went over. It happened in Lodore Canyon on May 30th. The rapid was bad, a drop and a series of waves and rocks that the boat should have been lined through rather than run. Exactly how the decision to run it was made is not entirely clear from the surviving accounts, but the no-name went in, and it did not come through. The boat capsized in the rapid and was carried downstream, smashing against rocks, breaking apart. Oromel and Seneca Howland and Frank Goodman were thrown into the water. They survived. All 3 of them made it to shore, battered and shaken, but alive. The boat did not survive in any useful sense. It was wrecked, and with it went a significant portion of what the expedition was carrying. They lost roughly a third of their food supply. 2 of the barometers went down with the no-name, those carefully packed, irreplaceable instruments that Powell needed for his altitude readings. Personal gear belonging to the 3 men in the boat was gone. It was a serious loss, and it happened before they had even properly entered the canyon system. Powell's response, by George Bradley's account, was measured. He did not rage. He did not despair. He assessed what remained, made adjustments to the plan, and continued. He was a man who had lost his arm at Shiloh and gone back to commanding artillery, and the wreck of a supply boat, as bad as it was, did not break his composure. The crew watched him absorb it and recalibrate, and that mattered. In a small group under pressure, the leader's response to disaster sets the temperature for everyone else. There was, however, one thing Powell could not fully control, and that was the growing awareness among the crew that this river was not going to be easy. The no-name had gone over in a rapid that might have been avoided. The food supply was already reduced, the instruments were already compromised, and they were barely started. The canyon walls were rising around them, and the maps, such as they were, showed nothing useful about what lay ahead. They were moving into country that existed on no reliable chart, navigating by the river itself and by Powell's readings, and by whatever could be seen from the canyon rim, when someone climbed high enough to see anything at all. Frank Goodman, for his part, had seen enough. He would leave the expedition a short while later at the Winter River Agency, the first man to step away from the journey. He had come with enthusiasm, and the enthusiasm had met the reality of the river, and the river had won. No one seems to have blamed him much. He had nearly drowned in the no-name, and that tends to clarify a person's priorities. Powell noted his departure in his journal without apparent judgment and kept moving. The crew that remained, 8 men now including Powell, continued south into the canyon country. The walls kept rising, the river kept moving. Powell climbed wherever he could, pulling himself up rock faces with one arm and whatever grip his stump could find against the stone, taking readings with the surviving instruments, recording what he saw. The canyon was beginning to show him its layers, its history, its extraordinary depth of time, and he was watching it with the full attention of a man who had spent his whole life learning how to see. The next stretch of river would test them in ways the first weeks had only hinted at. What the Green River gave them in those early weeks was a kind of education, a rough one, but thorough. The canyon country of Wyoming and northern Utah is not the Grand Canyon. It is not as deep, not as famous, not as photographed, but it is serious terrain, and the river moving through it is serious water, and the expedition was learning on the job in the way that people learn things when there is no other option. Every rapid taught them something. Every portage cost them time and energy, and a little more of the food they could not afford to lose. Every night camped on a narrow sandbar between canyon walls and dark water added to the crew's growing understanding of what they had actually signed up for. Powell's method continued to be the same. Careful, systematic, unhurried in his thinking, even when the river was moving fast. He would bring the boats to shore above a difficult stretch, climb as high as he could manage, study the water below and make his decision. The climbing was something the crew watched with a mixture of admiration and quiet anxiety. Powell had one arm. The right arm was gone from above the elbow, lost at Shiloh, and what remained was a stump that he had learned over 7 years to use with surprising effectiveness. He had developed a leather strap that looped around it, allowing him to hook onto rock edges and pull himself upward. It was not elegant. It was not safe in any conventional sense. But he did it, repeatedly, on canyon walls that a 2-armed man would have found challenging. The crew could not stop him, and probably knew better than to try. The geological reading was constant. As the walls rose around them through the canyons of northern Utah, Powell was looking at something that most people, passing through that country, would simply experience as scenery. He was reading it. The layers of rock that made up the canyon walls, the different colours, the different textures, the way one band of stone sat on top of another, these were not decoration to Powell. They were a record. Each layer represented a period of time, a particular kind of ancient environment. An old sea floor, a desert, a river delta, a shallow coastal plain. As the expedition descended in elevation, they were, in a sense, descending through time, the rock getting older as they went deeper. It was a concept Powell found genuinely moving, not just intellectually interesting, and it showed in the way he wrote about the canyon walls in his journal, with a kind of reverence that was rare in a man who was otherwise quite practical. The canyon country through which the Green River runs before reaching the Colorado is a landscape of remarkable variety. There are stretches where the walls are relatively low and the river moves through open country, and then the canyon closes in again and the walls come up and the light narrows and the sound of the river fills everything. The crew moved through this landscape day after day, camping where they could find flat ground, eating what remained of their rations, repairing the boats in the evenings, and trying to keep their spirits from sinking too far. The loss of the no-name and its supplies had been a real blow, and the departure of Frank Goodman had made the group smaller and quieter. 8 men now, in 3 boats, moving through country that had no maps and no margin for further serious loss. The crew was a varied group, and the differences between them were becoming more apparent as the journey continued. Jack Sumner was a fur trapper and mountain man, experienced and tough, someone who understood difficult country in a physical, practical way. George Bradley was a former army sergeant. Powell had actually arranged his discharge from the army specifically to bring him on this expedition, and Bradley was methodical and reliable, the kind of man who kept a diary and wrote in it honestly, even when what he was writing was not reassuring. Andy Hall was the youngest of the group, somewhere around 19 years old, a Scottish-born adventurer who had drifted west and ended up on this river almost by chance, and who seems to have found the whole thing more exciting than terrifying, at least in the early weeks. Walter Powell, John's older brother, was a more complicated presence. He'd served in the Civil War and had been captured and held as a prisoner for a time, and the experience had left marks on him. He was prone to mood swings, to periods of darkness that the other men found difficult to manage. Powell kept an eye on his brother without making it obvious, or tried to. Orrimal Howland was the remaining Howland brother. Seneca had been in the no-name wreck but stayed on. And Orrimal was a printer, and something of an intellectual, a man with opinions and a tendency to voice them. He and Powell would eventually have a serious disagreement, though that was still weeks away. For now, the group held together, moved together, worked together with the kind of functional cooperation that hard shared circumstances produce, even among people who are not particularly similar. They were moving through what is now called the Canyon of Lodore, then south through Split Mountain Canyon, and then into a brief stretch of open valley near the Winter River, where the Winter River Agency offered the first contact with the outside world since their launch. This was where Goodman left. It was also where Powell sent letters, dispatches back to the institutions that had supported him, to newspapers that were following the expedition, to his wife Emma back in Illinois. He wrote about what they had seen, what they had lost, what lay ahead. The letters went out and the expedition went on. Below the winter, the river re-entered canyon country, and the walls began to rise again. Powell named features as they went, not randomly, but with the deliberateness of a man who understood that naming was a form of claiming, a way of bringing unknown country into the map and the record. Desolation Canyon, Grey Canyon. The names were honest, which is one thing you can say for them. The country was, in stretches, genuinely desolate. High walls, narrow sky, the river moving through rock that showed no particular interest in human presence. The crew was working hard every day, and the work was wearing on them. What made the situation manageable, when it was manageable, was Powell himself. Not because he was warm in the conventional sense. The accounts suggest he was not especially easy to know, that he had a certain reserve about him, a formality that came from somewhere in his upbringing or his nature. But he was steady. Steadiness in a leader is worth a great deal when the situation is uncertain, and the situation was almost always uncertain. He made decisions without visible panic. He explained his reasoning to the crew when he could. He kept working, kept climbing, kept taking readings, kept writing in his journal, and the sight of him working had a stabilizing effect on the men around him. If the man with one arm was still climbing canyon walls and taking barometric measurements, perhaps things were not entirely beyond control. The food situation was the thing that worried everyone most. They had lost a significant portion of their supplies in the no-name wreck, and what remained was not in great shape. The bacon had been wet repeatedly and was starting to smell. The flour was damp and had begun to develop a grey, unpleasant quality. The dried apples were holding up reasonably well, which tells you something about dried apples. Coffee remained, and coffee mattered. In the evenings, camped on whatever flat ground the canyon offered, the crew drank coffee and ate what there was to eat, and tried not to calculate too carefully how many days of food remained against how many days of river lay ahead, because no one knew how many days of river lay ahead. That was the problem. There was no way to know. Powell's barometric readings were giving him information about their elevation and their rate of descent, and from this he could make rough calculations about how far they still had to travel before reaching the lower river, where the canyon would open out and the journey would effectively end. But these calculations depended on the accuracy of instruments that had already suffered damage and loss, and they depended on assumptions about the river's gradient that could only be estimated. The numbers were real, but the confidence interval around them was wide. Powell kept the worst of his uncertainty to himself and shared his estimates with the crew in the most reassuring form he could honestly give them. The days had a rhythm to them by now. Wake before full light, load the boats, move down river, reading the water, stopping to scout the bad stretches, running what could be run, lining or portaging what could not. In the afternoon, if there was a good cliff to climb, Powell would climb it and take his readings. In the evening, camp, eat, write. Bradley wrote in his diary almost every night, and his entries from this stretch of the journey are among the most vivid surviving records of what the expedition actually felt like from the inside. He wrote about the heat, which was already significant even in June in the canyon country. He wrote about the walls, about the colour of the rock, about the sound of the river at night. He wrote about the rapids with a kind of flat honesty. This one was bad. This one nearly took us. This one we portaged for 4 hours in temperatures that made the work almost unbearable. He did not dramatise, he just wrote down what happened. What was happening in the larger sense was that the expedition was moving steadily toward the Colorado River, where the Green River would join it, and from that confluence the canyon country would deepen, and the river would grow stronger, and the real difficulty of the journey would begin. The Green River had given them rapids and loss, and the wreck of the No Name and the departure of Goodman. It had given them their first real understanding of what moving through unmapped canyon country in wooden boats actually involved. It had given them the beginning of a routine, a set of procedures for dealing with difficult water, a working relationship between the men and the river and with each other. But the Colorado was something else. Even in 1869, even without maps or reliable accounts, the men had a sense that the country below the confluence was different in scale from anything they had yet encountered. The canyon walls they had seen so far, impressive as they were a prelude. The river below was going to be larger, louder, and considerably less forgiving. Powell knew this from his geological reading of the rock. The deeper they went into the canyon country, the older the rock became, and the older the rock, the deeper the cutting, and the deeper the cutting, the more violent the water that had done the cutting over millions of years. The river had made this canyon, the river was still making it, and they were going to put wooden boats into it and see what happened. The confluence was still ahead of them. The canyon walls were still rising. The river was still moving as it always moved, without particular concern for the men on its surface, or the instruments they carried, or the names they were giving to the features it had spent millions of years creating. Powell looked at the walls and kept reading. The crew looked at the water and kept going. And somewhere ahead, just out of sight around the next bend, the canyon was deepening, the rock was getting older, and the Colorado was waiting. There is something particular about the way Powell looked at canyon walls. Most of the crew saw rock. They saw obstacles, surfaces to climb or avoid, the hard edges of a landscape that was trying to make their lives difficult. Powell saw something else. He saw time, not in a vague or poetic sense, in a precise, technical, deeply educated sense. He had spent years studying geology before the expedition, reading the foundational texts of the field, attending lectures, collecting specimens, corresponding with the leading naturalists of his era. When the canyon walls began to rise around the boats in the weeks after the No Name wreck, Powell was reading them the way a scholar reads a manuscript, carefully, with attention to detail, with a growing sense of what the text was actually saying. The layers of rock that made up the canyon walls were not random. They were a record. Each distinct band of colour and texture represented a different geological period, a different era of deposition, a different chapter in the long history of the land. Powell recognised them. The reddish-brown layers near the top of the canyon in the Green River country were relatively young. Permian sandstones and limestones formed roughly 270 million years ago, when the region had been a shallow inland sea and then a coastal plain. As the river cut deeper and the walls rose higher, older layers came into view beneath. Carboniferous limestone, grey and dense, deposited when the area had been covered by warm tropical seas during a period now called the Mississippian. Below that, Devonian formations. Below that, Cambrian sandstones, some of the oldest sedimentary rock in the region, laid down more than 500 million years ago when the first complex animal life was just beginning to appear in the world's oceans. To descend the river was, in a very literal sense, to descend through time. Each mile of forward progress was also a step backward into geological history. The canyon was not just a physical feature of the landscape, it was a cross-section through the history of the Earth, cut open by the river over millions of years and exposed for the first time to a man who had the training to understand what he was seeing. Powell understood this with a clarity that few people in 1869 could have matched. The science of stratigraphy, the reading of rock layers as a record of time, was still relatively new. Charles Lyell's foundational work had been published only a few decades earlier. Darwin's theory of evolution, which depended on the same deep timescales that geology was revealing, had been published just 10 years before the expedition launched. Powell was working at the edge of what was known, and the canyon was giving him evidence that confirmed and extended the picture. He wrote in his journal about the walls constantly. The entries are specific and careful. He notes the colour, the texture, the approximate thickness of each layer, the angle of the beds where they had been tilted by ancient geological forces. He estimated the total depth of the canyon's exposed rock record at around 270 million years, a figure that later geological work would largely confirm. He noted where the layers were horizontal, undisturbed since the day they were deposited, and where they had been folded or faulted by the movement of the Earth's crust. He was building a picture, section by section, as the river carried him deeper into the rock. His method for taking measurements was, given his physical situation, remarkable. He carried 2 barometers, aneroid instruments that measured atmospheric pressure and allowed him to calculate altitude. After the loss of the barometers in the no-name wreck, the crew had managed to repair one of the damaged instruments, and Powell used it with something close to reverence. At every opportunity, he would climb out of the canyon to a high point and take a reading, comparing the pressure at the canyon rim to the pressure at the river level below, calculating the difference in elevation. From these readings, he built up a profile of the river's descent, how fast they were dropping, how much elevation remained between them and the lower river, how the gradient changed from one section of the canyon to the next. The climbing itself was the thing that worried the crew. A man with one arm had no business on the kind of terrain Powell routinely climbed. The canyon walls in this country were not gentle slopes. They were sheer faces of fractured sandstone and limestone, broken by ledges and cracks, often crumbling underfoot, always steep. Powell climbed them anyway. He had developed a technique over his years of fieldwork in the Rocky Mountains that allowed him to move across difficult rock with surprising confidence. He used his left hand as a primary grip and braced his right shoulder, the shortened limb where his arm ended just below the shoulder, against rock faces for balance and support. He also used a leather strap looped around the stump of his right arm, which he could hook over protrusions or thread through cracks to give himself a third point of contact when the climbing required it. The strap was a simple tool, improvised from necessity, but it was effective. The crew watched him climb with a mixture of admiration and quiet dread. George Bradley, who was himself an experienced outdoorsman, wrote that watching Powell navigate a difficult cliff face was both impressive and genuinely nerve-wracking. There were moments when the right thing to feel was probably nothing, because feeling anything too strongly about what Powell was doing would have made it impossible to watch. What he was doing up on those walls was not just taking measurements. He was also looking at the geology from a perspective the river couldn't give him. From the rim, or from a high ledge partway up the wall, he could see the structure of the canyon in 3 dimensions. The way the layers dipped and rose, the way faults had offset the rock, the way erosion had carved side canyons into the main walls. He was building a mental model of the canyon structure that went beyond what any individual measurement could provide. He was trying to understand how the canyon had been made. The answer, as Powell came to understand it, was the river. Not a catastrophic event, not a sudden violent rupture of the Earth's surface, but the patient, continuous work of moving water over an almost incomprehensible span of time. The Colorado River had not cut through the canyon country because the land was low. It had cut through it because the land had been rising, slowly, over millions of years, and the river had simply kept cutting downward at the same rate the land was rising, maintaining its course while the rock around it was lifted up on either side. The canyon was not a hole in the earth. It was the record of a river that had refused to move. This idea would become one of the central contributions of Powell's later scientific work. After the expedition, he developed and refined the concept of what he called base level, the theoretical lowest point to which a river can erode its bed, determined by the level of the body of water into which it flows. A river can only cut downward to the level of the sea, or of the lake or river it empties into. Below that level, erosion stops. The concept sounds simple, but its implications for understanding landscape formation were significant. It gave geologists a framework for explaining why rivers cut the valleys they cut, why canyons are as deep as they are and no deeper, why the shape of the land reflects the long history of water moving across it. Powell would coin the term base level in his 1875 report, and it remains standard geological terminology today. But the thinking behind it began here, in the canyon, watching the river and climbing the walls and reading the rock. The crew, for their part, were not geologists. They appreciated the canyon walls in a different way, mostly as obstacles, sometimes as spectacles, occasionally as things of genuine beauty when the light was right, and the immediate situation was not too desperate. Jack Sumner, who was probably the most experienced outdoorsman in the group and had been on Powell's earlier Rocky Mountain expeditions, had a practical, unsentimental relationship with the landscape. He noted geological features in his own journal, but in terms of what they meant for navigation, not for science. A certain kind of cliff meant a certain kind of rapid below. A change in the rock type meant a change in the river's character. He was reading the canyon too, but for different information. George Bradley was more reflective. His diary entries from this stretch of the journey include passages that are genuinely observational, in a way that goes beyond simple record keeping. He wrote about the colour of the walls at different times of day, the deep red of the Permian sandstone in the morning light, the way the shadows moved across the canyon face in the afternoon, the strange, luminous quality the rock had in the last hour before dark. He was not a trained naturalist, but he was paying attention, and his attention produced descriptions that still hold up. When he wrote that the canyon was unlike anything he had imagined, he was not being rhetorical. He meant it literally. The canyon was genuinely outside the range of things that most people in 1869 had any framework for imagining. Powell, of course, had a framework. His training gave him one. But even he, writing in his journal in the evenings after a day of climbing and measuring and running rapids, allowed himself moments of something that went beyond the scientific. He wrote about the immensity of the canyon in terms that were not purely geological. He wrote about the feeling of being very small in a very old place. He wrote about the silence, or rather the absence of human sound, because the river was never silent, but there was no human sound in the canyon except what the 9 of them made, and that sound was absorbed almost immediately by the walls and the water and the space. He had been in remote places before. The Rocky Mountains were remote, but this was different. The canyon had a quality of depth that the mountains did not. In the mountains, you could see the sky in all directions. In the canyon, the sky was a strip of blue above you, and the walls were everything else, and the walls were very old, and they had been there long before anything human had existed to look at them. The barometric readings were telling Powell something else too, beyond the immediate data about altitude and descent rate. They were telling him that the river still had a long way to go. He was calculating as carefully as his instruments, and his training allowed, and the numbers were not entirely reassuring. The rate of descent was significant. They were dropping in elevation faster than he had initially estimated, which meant the rapids were likely to be more frequent and more violent than he had hoped. He shared his calculations with the crew in the most measured way he could, emphasizing the positive interpretation. They were making progress, the end of the canyon country was approaching, while not entirely concealing the less comfortable implication, which was that the most difficult water was probably still ahead. He was right about that. The Green River had been a preparation, a rough one with real losses and real danger, but a preparation nonetheless. The river ahead, the Colorado proper, below the confluence, was something else. Powell knew it from the geology. The canyon walls were going to get taller, the rock was going to get harder, the gradient was going to steepen, and somewhere ahead, in the deepest part of the canyon, the river had cut down through all the sedimentary layers to the basement rock beneath. The ancient dark stone that had been there since before any of the limestone or sandstone above it had been deposited before there had been any sea or shore or living thing to leave a record in the rock. That rock was called Vishnu Schist, though Powell would not name it that on this journey. It was among the oldest exposed rock in North America. And the river ran through it in a gorge so deep and narrow that the sky above was barely visible, and the rapids in it were unlike anything the crew had yet encountered. The confluence was getting closer. The canyon walls were already higher than they had been a week ago. The river was faster. The sound of it at night, camped on whatever gravel bar or ledge the canyon offered, was louder than it had been at the start. Powell lay in his bedroll and listened to it and thought about what the rock was telling him, and what the barometer was telling him, and what the calculations on his papers were telling him. The walls around him held 270 million years of history, and he was one of the first people to read any of it. That was a remarkable thing. He knew it was a remarkable thing. But there was also the practical matter of the river, and the boats, and the food, and the men. The canyon's geological record would still be there after the expedition. The men and the boats and the food were a more immediate concern, and the river ahead was going to test all three of them in ways that the Green River had only begun to suggest. And then the river showed them what it had been holding back. Cataract Canyon begins in southeastern Utah, roughly where the Green River and the Colorado River meet at their confluence, and it does not ease you in. The canyon announces itself through sound before it announces itself through sight. The crew heard it before they saw it. A low, continuous roar that grew as they rounded each bend, not the sharp crack of a single rapid, but something more sustained, more total, as if the river ahead had simply decided to become something different from what it had been. Powell noted the sound in his journal. He wrote that it was unlike the rapids they had encountered on the Green River, which had been loud enough in their own right, but which had always been followed by quieter water. This sound did not stop. It continued around the next bend, and the one after that, and the one after that. 14 miles. That is the length of Cataract Canyon. In those 14 miles, Powell counted 75 distinct rapids. Not stretches of rough water, not general turbulence, but 75 individual, identifiable drops where the river fell and churned and threw itself against the canyon walls with enough force to destroy a wooden boat and the men inside it without much effort or notice. By any measure of river difficulty, Cataract Canyon in the summer of 1869 was among the most violent stretches of navigable water in North America. And the crew of the Colorado River exploring expedition was going to have to get through all of it in boats that were already damaged, with food that was already running short, in temperatures that the canyon floor concentrated and amplified until the air itself felt like something you had to push through. It was mid-July. The canyon walls in that part of Utah trap heat the way a stone oven does, radiating it back from the rock long after the sun has moved. Powell recorded temperatures that exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit on the canyon floor. The crew worked in that heat carrying gear, lining boats, portaging around the worst of the rapids. Portaging meant unloading everything from the boats, carrying it along the canyon wall over whatever footing the rock offered, sometimes climbing, sometimes edging along ledges barely wide enough for a boot, and then going back for more. Thousands of pounds of supplies moved by hand in the heat, over rock, and then the boats themselves had to be handled, lowered on ropes through the rapid, or dragged along the shore, or in some cases lifted entirely. The boats were heavy, even empty. The oak pilot boats weighed several hundred pounds without any cargo. Moving them required the full effort of every man available, and the footing was never good, and the river was always close, and a slip meant something serious. The food situation had been deteriorating for weeks, but Cataract Canyon accelerated the problem. The bacon, which had been one of their primary sources of protein, had gone rancid in the heat. It was not a subtle thing. It was genuinely inedible, the kind of rancid that makes the decision for you. They threw it away, or as much of it as they could bring themselves to discard when they were already calculating how many days of food remained. The flour was worse in a different way. It had been wet so many times, from the capsize of the No Name back in Lador Canyon, from waves breaking over the boats in rapids, from rain and river spray. That much of it had gone mouldy. What remained that was usable had to be sifted and dried and used carefully. The dried apples were holding up better than most things, but there were not many of them. Coffee they still had, which is perhaps the most telling detail about what they chose to protect. The crew was running on a combination of careful rationing, physical exhaustion, and the kind of determination that does not feel like determination from the inside, but just feels like continuing to do the next thing that needs doing. George Bradley was keeping his diary through all of it, and his entries from this stretch of the journey are the most detailed and emotionally honest surviving record of what those days were like. Bradley was not a man who dramatized things unnecessarily. He was a practical person, a former soldier, someone who had seen difficult situations before and did not reach for theatrical language to describe them, which makes his entries from Cataract Canyon all the more striking, because even Bradley, writing in his plain and direct way, allowed himself to say that he was not sure they were going to survive. Not in those exact words, but close enough. He wrote about the rapids with a kind of careful precision that was also, underneath the precision, a form of fear. He wrote about the boats taking on water, about the difficulty of the portages, about the heat and the food, and the river that showed no sign of relenting. He wrote that the canyon gave them no encouragement. That is a quiet sentence, but it carries a lot of weight when you consider what he was looking at every day. Walls of rock rising 1,000 feet on either side, a river that wanted to destroy them, and no way out except through. Walter Powell was not doing well. John's younger brother had come on the expedition partly as a kind of companion, and partly, one suspects, because John felt responsible for him. Walter had served in the Civil War and had been a prisoner of war, and whatever had happened to him during that time had left marks that were not entirely visible, but were becoming more apparent as the expedition wore on. He was volatile in ways that made the other crew members uncomfortable. He could be silent for long stretches and then suddenly angry, or agitated, or simply unreachable in a way that was hard to describe but easy to feel. The other men gave him space. John treated him with a careful patience that was never quite explained in the journals but was clearly deliberate. In the tight quarters of the expedition, with the stress of the canyon and the heat and the diminishing food, Walter's instability was another weight the group carried. Nobody wrote about it directly. It was not the kind of thing men in 1869 wrote about directly. But it surfaces in the margins of the journals, in the way certain names appear and then don't appear in accounts of particular events. Walter was there, and he was struggling, and everyone knew it, and nobody said it plainly. Powell himself, through all of this, maintained a composure that the other men found either reassuring or slightly unnerving, depending on the day. He continued his scientific work in Cataract Canyon even as everything else was fraying. He climbed out of the canyon at every opportunity to take barometric readings. He recorded the geological strata. He named features and made notes and kept his instruments as dry as he could manage. There is something almost stubborn about this, and maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe it was the thing that kept him from falling into the same exhaustion and despair that was pulling at the rest of the crew. If he was doing science, he was still on an expedition. If he was still on an expedition, there was still a purpose. The purpose held the thing together, or at least it held him together, and he was the one holding the group together, so the chain of dependency ran all the way back to the barometer and the notebook. He also understood, in a way that the others could not entirely share, what the canyon was telling him geologically. The rock in Cataract Canyon is primarily sandstone and limestone, the same broad categories as the Green River Canyons, but compressed and folded in ways that spoke to enormous ancient pressures. The canyon walls were doing something specific here. They were narrowing, and the river was responding by accelerating, and the combination of the narrowing and the acceleration and the hardness of the rock produced rapids of a particular character. They were not just big, they were technically complex with hydraulic features that could trap a boat or flip it in ways that a simpler rapid could not. Powell had enough river experience by this point to read the shape of a rapid from above, to identify the main current and the eddies and the places where the water folded back on itself. He made those assessments carefully before each rapid, climbing to whatever vantage point the canyon offered, studying the water, making a decision. Run it, line it, or portage. Sometimes he was wrong about which choice was right, and they learned that in the moment, in the rapid, with the boat and the water and the canyon walls all contributing their opinions simultaneously. The portages were the most exhausting part. A day spent portaging a difficult rapid might cover 1/4 of a mile of actual river distance. 1/4 of a mile after a full day of labour in 100-degree heat. The crew would make camp at the end of such a day having moved almost no distance at all on the map, and they would eat whatever the food situation allowed, which was less and less, and they would sleep on whatever flat surface the canyon provided, which was often not much, and in the morning they would do it again. Bradley wrote that some mornings it was difficult to feel the point of getting up. He got up anyway, they all did. That is perhaps the simplest and truest thing to say about the crew in Cataract Canyon. They kept getting up, and they kept going, even when the river gave them no particular reason to expect that the next day would be better than the one before. 75 rapids in 14 miles. They got through all of them. It took several days that felt much longer than several days. The boats were battered. The oak hulls had taken impacts and abrasions that left them leaking at multiple points, and the crew was constantly bailing and patching and making do with what they had. The Emma Dean, Powell's smaller pine boat, was lighter and more manoeuvrable than the others, which had saved it in several situations where the heavier boats would have been in serious trouble. But lighter also meant less stable in big water, and there were moments in Cataract Canyon where Powell, standing at the stern with his one arm, was navigating water that no reasonable person would have chosen to navigate in a 16-foot wooden boat. And then, somewhere around the 14th mile, the canyon opened slightly. Not dramatically. The walls were still high, the river was still moving, but the character of the water changed. The continuous roar that had been their constant companion for days softened into something more intermittent. There were stretches of calmer water between the rapids. The rapids themselves were still significant, but they were no longer relentless in the same way. The crew felt the change before they fully understood it. Something in the body knows when the worst of something has passed, even before the mind has confirmed it. They had come through Cataract Canyon. They were still alive, all of them. The boats were still floating, barely, but floating. The food was nearly gone, but there was still some. The river ahead was still unknown, still unmapped, still potentially dangerous in ways they could not yet see. But Cataract Canyon was behind them, and that was something. Powell noted the change in his journal in his characteristic way, factually with a brief acknowledgement of what they had endured, and then a turn toward what came next. He was already calculating. The barometric readings told him they were still well above the elevation of the known lower river. There was still a great deal of canyon ahead. The walls around them were still rising in some places, still holding the river in that particular way that meant the gradient was not finished with them yet. But the river ahead, for now, was slower, and somewhere not too far downstream, the canyon was going to change again. The character of the rock, the width of the channel, the quality of the light. Powell had been reading the walls long enough to sense these transitions before they arrived. What none of them knew yet was that the next stretch of river was going to be the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. That after Cataract Canyon, after the heat and the rancid food and the 75 rapids and the days of brutal portaging and Bradley's quiet fear written into his diary and Walter's instability and the river that gave no encouragement. After all of that, the Colorado was going to offer them something entirely different. A canyon of smooth red walls and clear side streams and hanging gardens, and silence of a different kind from the silence they had known. A place so unlike what they had just been through that it would take a moment to trust it. Powell would write about it later as the most beautiful place he'd ever encountered in all his years of travelling through the American landscape. He would name it Glen Canyon. He would describe it in language that was, for him, unusually personal, unusually open to something beyond the scientific. But that was still ahead of them, around the next bend or the one after that, waiting in the way that beautiful things wait, quietly, without announcement, indifferent to whether you deserve them or not. And Glen Canyon arrived exactly like that, without announcement, without any particular signal from the river that something was about to change. The walls simply shifted. The dark, fractured, punishing rock of the upper canyons giving way to smooth red sandstone that curved and flowed, as if it had been shaped by something slower and more patient than water, though of course it was water and wind and time and nothing else. The colour was different too. Not the grey and brown of Cataract Canyon's walls, but a deep, warm red that caught the light in the late afternoon and held it, so that the canyon glowed from the inside in a way that none of the men had seen before in all the weeks they had been travelling between stone walls. Powell noticed it immediately. He noticed everything, but this he noticed differently. Not as data, not as stratigraphy to be recorded, but as something that worked on him before he had the chance to be scientific about it. The river here was slow. That was the first thing the crew felt in their bodies before they saw anything else. The absence of urgency in the water. After Cataract Canyon, after weeks of reading the surface of the river for the signs of what was coming, watching for the change in colour that meant shallows, the white line across the horizon that meant a drop, the low roar that built gradually and then was suddenly all around you. After all of that, the quiet of this stretch of river was almost disorienting. The current still moved. They still made progress downstream, but the water was smooth and clear, and you could see the bottom in the shallows, and there was no particular sound except the movement of the oars and the small sounds the boats made against each other when they drifted close. Powell named it Glen Canyon. He wrote the name in his journal and described the walls and the quality of the light, and the way the sandstone had been carved into alcoves and curves and chambers by the slow work of water over what he understood to be an enormous amount of time. The Navajo sandstone that made up much of these walls had been deposited roughly 190 million years ago, when this part of the continent was covered by a vast system of sand dunes, and the layers of that ancient desert were visible in the walls around them, cross-bedded, sweeping lines that recorded the direction of winds that had blown across a landscape no human being had ever seen, and no human being ever would. Powell saw those lines and understood what they were. That understanding did not make the walls less beautiful. If anything, it made them more so. There is something about knowing the age of a thing that changes how you look at it, and Powell had spent enough time in geology to feel that change as something almost physical. The crew rested here in a way they had not rested since the first days of the journey. The boats were pulled up on sandbars, and the damage from Cataract Canyon was assessed and repaired as well as it could be, with the tools and materials they had on hand. The oak hulls were patched. The leaking seams were recorked. The remaining food, what was left of the flour, the coffee, the dried apples, was spread out to dry in the sun, because much of it had been soaked repeatedly in the rapids and was beginning to go bad. They ate better here than they had in weeks, not because they had more food, but because they had time to prepare it properly, and because the simple fact of not being in immediate danger has a way of making food taste better than it actually is. Powell used the time differently from the crew. He rested too, but rest for him meant something other than lying in the shade. He explored the side canyons on foot, which in Glen Canyon were numerous and extraordinary. The main river channel had tributaries here, small streams that came in from the sides, fed by seeps and springs in the sandstone above, and these streams had carved their own narrow canyons over time, sinuous passages in the red rock that sometimes opened into larger chambers and sometimes narrowed until you could touch both walls with your outstretched hands. The light in these side canyons was something Powell tried to describe in his journal and found difficult. It was reflected light, mostly, sunlight bouncing off the curved red walls and arriving at the canyon floor softened and warm without the harshness of direct sun. Things grew in that light that had no business growing in the desert. Maidenhair ferns in thick green curtains along the seeping walls, columbine and monkey flower and wild orchid in the wet places near the streams. Hanging gardens, Powell called them, and the phrase was accurate. They hung from the walls in places where water seeped through the sandstone and emerged at the surface, and they were green and improbable and very much alive in a landscape that was otherwise stone and heat and sky. He found a particular place in a side canyon that he named Music Temple. It was a natural amphitheatre, a large domed chamber in the sandstone, perhaps 60 feet high, where the rock curved overhead in a smooth vault, and the acoustics were extraordinary. Sound in that space behaved differently than it did in the open canyon. It gathered and resonated, and when the crew gathered there and sang, which they did because Powell asked them to, because he wanted to hear what the space did with a human voice, the sound came back to them changed, warmer and fuller than it had left. Some of the men carved their names into the sandstone walls of Music Temple, and Powell recorded this in his journal. Those carvings remained there for nearly a century until the water came. But that's getting ahead of the story. Powell also named the Escalante River during this stretch of the journey, a tributary coming in from the east, a clear stream running through its own canyon system. He named it for the Spanish Franciscan friar Silvestre Vélez de Escalante, who had travelled through this region in 1776 as part of an expedition from Santa Fe to Monterey, though Escalante himself had never reached the river that now bore his name. Powell had a habit of naming things for people who had come before him in the broader history of exploration in this part of the continent, as if he understood that his own expedition was part of a longer sequence of human attention paid to this landscape, and not simply a beginning. There was a brief encounter with people near a place known as the Crossing of the Fathers, a ford on the Colorado that had been used for generations, one of the very few places in this part of the canyon country where the river could be crossed. Powell and some of the crew came across a small group of Ute people there. The meeting was cautious on both sides. There was no common language, and the situation had an inherent tension. A group of strange men in battered wooden boats, armed, travelling through country that was not theirs, meeting people for whom this landscape was home, in a way that Powell's expedition could not begin to approximate. But the encounter was peaceful. There was no confrontation. Powell noted it in his journal with characteristic brevity. A few sentences describing the meeting, an attempt to communicate, a mutual acknowledgement that neither group posed an immediate threat to the other, and then a parting. He did not record what the Ute people made of the expedition, because he had no way of knowing. That perspective is simply absent from the historical record, which is its own kind of loss. What Powell did record, in more detail than almost anything else in the Glen Canyon section of his journal, was his emotional response to the place. This is worth noting because Powell was not, by habit or temperament, a man who wrote extensively about his feelings. His journal is mostly observation and measurement and practical detail, but Glen Canyon drew something out of him that his scientific training did not have a category for, and he wrote about it in language that was more personal than usual. He wrote about the feeling of being the first person, the first group of people, to travel this stretch of river and look at these walls and name these canyons. He was aware in a way that was both exhilarating and slightly vertiginous, that no account existed of this place, that no map showed it with any accuracy, that the side canyons he walked into had never been entered by anyone who had left a record of having done so. He was not the first human being to see these places. The Ute people, the Paiute people, the ancestral Puebloans who had lived in this region for centuries before European contact, had all known this canyon country in ways far more intimate than Powell's brief passage through it. He understood this, at least partially. But he was the first to come through with instruments and notebooks and the specific intention of recording what was there, and he felt the weight of that task as something more than scientific duty. He wrote in one journal entry from this stretch of the journey about the sensation of looking at a canyon wall and understanding that no description of it yet existed in any language that would reach the broader world, and that he was about to write the first one. He seemed genuinely moved by this, not in a grandiose way, not with the self-congratulation that might have been expected from a man in his position, but in a quieter way, as if the responsibility of it had settled on him and he was trying to be equal to it. Whether his descriptions actually captured what Glen Canyon was, in the full sense of what it was, is a question that cannot be answered now, because Glen Canyon no longer exists in the form Powell saw it. But the attempt was sincere, and the journals from this stretch of the river are among the most readable and human things Powell ever wrote. The crew, for their part, seemed to feel the change in the canyon in a less philosophical and more straightforward way. They were resting. The boats were being repaired. The food, such as it was drying in the sun. Nobody was asking them to portage anything. The walls around them were beautiful in a way that even men who were not geologists and not writers could recognize and appreciate. George Bradley, whose diary had been so bleak in Cataract Canyon, wrote during the Glen Canyon stretch about the color of the walls and the clearness of the water in the side streams, and his tone was noticeably different from what it had been. Not optimistic, exactly. Bradley was not a particularly optimistic man, and the journey was far from over, but something closer to restored. As if the canyon had given them back something that Cataract Canyon had taken. It could not last, of course, and they knew it. Powell's barometric readings continued throughout Glen Canyon, and the numbers told a clear story. They had descended significantly in elevation since the beginning of the journey, but they had not descended nearly enough. The known lower river, where the canyon country ended and the desert opened out into something more navigable, was still a great deal of vertical distance below them. The walls around them were still over 1,000 feet high in places, and in some of the narrower stretches they rose higher than that. The river was still carrying them towards something unknown, and somewhere downstream, Powell had a rough sense of where, though no precise knowledge, the canyon was going to change again. The smooth red sandstone of Glen Canyon was going to give way to something older and harder. The gradient was going to steepen, the rapids were going to return. They lingered in Glen Canyon for a few days. Not long enough, perhaps, but longer than the pace of the journey had allowed them to linger anywhere else. Powell explored, the crew repaired and rested, and the river moved slowly beneath them in the late July heat. The side canyons waited in their silence. The hanging gardens grew where the water seeped through the stone. Music Temple held whatever sound was placed inside it, and gave it back transformed. And then they loaded the boats again, and pushed off from the sandbar, and the current took them. The walls slid past on either side, still red, still smooth, still beautiful in the particular way of Glen Canyon. But Powell was watching the river ahead, and he was also watching his instruments, and the numbers in his notebook were telling him that the easy part, if anything about this journey could be called easy, was coming to an end. Somewhere not far downstream, the little Colorado River would come in from the east, and at that confluence, if his rough calculations were correct, the Grand Canyon would begin. Not the canyon country they had been travelling through for weeks, which was already vast and extraordinary, but the Grand Canyon specifically, the place that existed on no reliable map, that no expedition had passed through and returned from with a complete account that Powell himself had described in his planning stages as the great unknown of the American continent. They were almost there. The river was carrying them toward it whether they were ready or not, and the sound of the water against the hull of the Emmeline was calm for now, but Powell knew enough about rivers to understand that calm is not a promise. It is simply a pause between one thing and whatever comes next. The little Colorado River comes in from the east, and when you see it on a map it looks like a minor detail, a thin blue line joining a larger one, the kind of confluence that appears dozens of times along any major river system, without warranting much attention. But Powell knew what it meant. He had studied what little information existed about the Colorado's course before the expedition departed, and the one thing that rough knowledge made clear was that the Little Colorado marked a threshold. Below that point, the canyon was something different. Below that point, the river entered territory that no expedition had mapped, no survey party had documented, no account had described in any reliable way. It was the doorway, and they were about to walk through it. They reached the confluence in late July. The Little Colorado was running a muddy, almost milky blue-green from the mineral content of its source springs, and where it met the Colorado, the two colours swirled together for a short distance before the larger river absorbed the smaller one entirely. Powell stopped the boats. He gathered the crew on the bank, which was a narrow strip of sand and rock at the base of walls that had been climbing steadily higher for days. He did not give a speech. Exactly. Powell was not a speech-making kind of man, or at least he did not record having given one. But he acknowledged plainly what they were facing. He told them that the canyon ahead was unknown. Not poorly known, not partially documented, but genuinely unknown in the sense that no one had passed through it, and returned with information that could help them. He told them that his barometric readings indicated they still had a significant amount of elevation to lose before they reached the lower river, where the canyon country ended, and the terrain became something a person could navigate on foot if necessary. He had calculated as best as he could with the instruments he had that they were still somewhere in the neighbourhood of 6,000 feet above the known lower river in terms of vertical drop remaining. 6,000 feet. In the context of a river journey, that number is not about height in the way you might think of a mountain. It is about gradient, about how steeply and how quickly the river must descend over the remaining distance, and what that descent means for the water moving through a narrow canyon. It means rapids, it means a lot of them, and it means they will be violent. The crew heard this. They had been on the river long enough to understand what the numbers meant, even the ones who did not have Powell's geological training. George Bradley, who had been keeping his diary with a consistency that is remarkable given the conditions, wrote on or around this date that they were now ready to start on their way down what he called the Great Unknown. Powell's own journal uses almost exactly the same phrase, and it is worth pausing on that for a moment. The Great Unknown. It was not a poetic flourish invented later for the published account. Both men wrote it independently in their private notes, which suggests it was simply the phrase the crew had been using among themselves. That is what they called the canyon ahead. Not the Grand Canyon, that name would come later, and Powell himself would help establish it. In the summer of 1869, standing on a sandbank at the mouth of the Little Colorado, it was the Great Unknown, a place defined entirely by the absence of information. What Powell did not tell the crew, or at least did not record having told them, was how uncertain he actually was. His calculations about the remaining descent were based on barometric readings taken with instruments that had been repaired after being damaged earlier in the journey. Readings compared against known elevations that were themselves only roughly established, and a series of assumptions about the river's course that could not be verified until they were actually on the water. He was confident enough to continue. He had always been confident enough to continue, which was both his greatest asset and at times a source of real friction with the men around him. But confidence is not the same as certainty, and Powell was a careful enough scientist to know the difference. He knew that the 6,000 feet of remaining descent was an estimate. He knew that the canyon ahead might be worse than anything they had encountered, or it might open up unexpectedly, or the gradient might distribute itself more gently than the numbers suggested. He did not know. Nobody knew. That was the whole point. They pushed off from the confluence and entered Marble Canyon, which is the name given to the entry corridor of the Grand Canyon proper, a stretch of roughly 60 miles where the river cuts through Redwall limestone and Muave limestone, in walls that rise with startling speed as you move downstream. Powell named it Marble Canyon because the polished limestone walls had a texture and a sheen that reminded him of marble, though there is very little actual marble in the formation. The name stuck anyway, as Powell's names tended to do, because he was the one writing things down and the one whose account would eventually be read. The canyon here is narrow. In some places the walls are so close together that you can look straight up from the river and see only a thin strip of sky, the walls rising 800, 1,000, 1,200 feet on either side. The sound changes in a place like that. The river noise fills the space completely, bouncing off stone, and it becomes something you feel as much as hear. Powell's barometric readings in Marble Canyon were alarming in the specific quiet way that data can be alarming when you are the only person who fully understands what it means. The river was dropping. Not gradually, not in the smooth way a river drops through open country, but in the sharp, irregular way that means rapids. That means the riverbed is stepping down in sudden increments. Each step a rapid, each rapid a decision about whether to run it, line the boats around it with ropes or carry everything overland on foot. The portages had been brutal in Cataract Canyon. The crew had moved thousands of pounds of gear over slick, uneven canyon walls in 100-degree heat. They could not afford to do that indefinitely. The food situation was getting serious. What had started as roughly 10,000 pounds of supplies at Green River City had been reduced by weeks of consumption, by the losses in Lodore Canyon, by spoilage in the heat. The bacon was largely inedible. The flour was mixed with river water and mould, and had been baked into a kind of dense, gritty bread that the crew ate without complaint because there was nothing else. The dried apples were mostly gone. The coffee, at least, was holding out, which was perhaps the one mercy. The roar of rapids became constant in Marble Canyon. Not every stretch was violent. There were calmer sections where the river moved with a deep, muscular smoothness, the current strong but the surface unbroken. But the sound of white water was never entirely absent. It was always there, somewhere ahead, or behind, or echoing off the walls from some unseen bend. The crew had learned, over the weeks of the journey, to read that sound. They could tell from the pitch and volume of it, roughly, how serious a rapid was likely to be before they could see it. A low, even roar meant something manageable. A deeper, more chaotic sound with a kind of irregular percussion underneath it meant something that needed to be scouted. They had become, without quite intending to, expert readers of a landscape that had no existing literature. They were writing the first chapter of it in real time, with their bodies and their boats and their dwindling supply of food. Powell climbed whenever he could. This was his habit throughout the journey. Whenever the crew stopped to scout or portage a rapid, Powell would find a way up the canyon wall to take altitude readings from above, to look at the rock strata, to get a sense of what the river was doing from a perspective that the water itself could not provide. In Marble Canyon, the walls were steep and the handholds were not always obvious, and the crew had by this point grown accustomed to watching their one-armed leader work his way up faces of limestone that most of them would have hesitated to attempt with both hands. He used a leather strap looped around his right stump to grip holds that a hand could not grip, and he was apparently quite good at it, though the word apparently is doing some work there, good enough to have survived the journey without falling at least. George Bradley, who was himself an experienced outdoorsman, wrote about Powell's climbing with a mixture of admiration and what reads as barely suppressed anxiety. It was one thing to watch a man with two arms scale a canyon wall. It was another thing entirely to watch a man with one arm do it, and to be responsible for what happened if he didn't make it back down. The canyon walls above Marble Canyon were telling Powell something specific, and he was listening. The redwall limestone that formed the upper walls of this section was Mississippian in age, roughly 340 million years old. Below it, where the river was cutting, were older formations still. Powell had been descending through geological time since the beginning of the journey, reading the strata the way you might read the pages of a book stacked horizontally, each layer a chapter in a history so long that the human mind can hold it only in the abstract. But here, in Marble Canyon, he knew that the descent through time was about to accelerate. Below the limestone, below the older sedimentary layers, the river was going to reach something much older. The basement rock of the canyon, the Vishnu schist, and the Zoroaster granite of the inner gorge was down there somewhere, waiting. Nearly 2 billion years old. The oldest exposed rock in North America. Powell could not see it yet, but he knew it was coming, and he knew what it meant for the river. Hard rock does not erode easily. The river, cutting through granite and schist, would be confined in a gorge within the gorge, a narrow, steep-walled inner canyon where the rapids would be unlike anything they had encountered so far. The crew's silence in this stretch of the journey is notable. The diary entries from Marble Canyon are shorter than those from earlier sections, less descriptive, more functional. Bradley records distances and rapids and the state of the boats and the food. He does not write much about the landscape, which is striking because Marble Canyon is by any measure extraordinary to look at. The walls are extraordinary. The colour of the rock in afternoon light is extraordinary. But the crew was not at this point in a frame of mind to dwell on beauty. They were conserving energy. They were watching the river ahead. They were doing the quiet arithmetic that exhausted people do when they are trying to calculate how much further they can go and whether what they have left is enough to get them there. Powell was doing a different kind of arithmetic. He was tracking the numbers in his notebook. Elevations, positions, the rate of descent. And the numbers were telling him that they were close. Not close in the way that makes you feel relief, but close in the way that makes you understand that the hardest part is still ahead. The 6,000 feet of remaining descent was not going to happen gently. The river was going to earn every foot of it. And somewhere below them, in the inner gorge that he could not yet see but could already anticipate from the geological logic of the place, the Colorado was going to show them something they had not yet seen. Not just another rapid, not just another portage, something of a different order entirely. The canyon walls rose higher around them as they moved downstream, 3,000 feet now in some stretches. The sky above them reduced to a ribbon of blue or grey depending on the weather. The river narrowed. The sound of the water was constant and deep, and Powell sat in the bow of the Emma Dean, one arm resting on the gunwale, watching the river ahead with the particular quality of attention that had carried him this far. Not fearless exactly, but steady. The kind of steady that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having decided a long time ago that the fear was not going to be the thing that made the decision. Whatever was coming, they were going to meet it on the river. And then they were inside it. The Grand Canyon proper begins where the Colorado cuts down through the Kaibab Plateau and enters the inner gorge, and the change is not gradual. It is abrupt in the way that geological transitions often are. One kind of rock giving way to another, one chapter of time ending, and an older one beginning beneath your feet. For Powell and his crew, arriving in the Grand Canyon in early August of 1869, meant entering a place that no one they knew had ever described to them, because no one they knew had ever been there. They had been navigating without maps for weeks. Now they were navigating without even the second-hand accounts and rough sketches that had guided them through the upper canyons. The river ahead was completely unknown, and the walls around them were closing in. The inner canyon, what geologists call the Granite Gorge, is where the Colorado cuts through Vishnu schist and Zoroaster granite, the basement rock of the continent. Powell had anticipated this. He had known from the geological logic of the place that the river would eventually reach the old hard rock, and now it had. The Vishnu schist is approximately 1.7 billion years old. That number is difficult to hold in the mind in any meaningful way. The Earth itself is about 4.5 billion years old, which means this rock formed when the planet was less than 3 billion years old. Before complex life, before the Cambrian explosion, before almost everything we think of when we think of the history of living things. It is dark and dense and streaked with pink veins of granite, and the walls of the inner gorge rise nearly vertically from the water's edge. There is almost no shore. The river fills the canyon nearly wall to wall in places, and the sound of the water in that enclosed space is something different from what they had heard in the wider canyons above. It is lower, more resonant, more total. It fills the air the way sound fills a room with no windows. The rapids in the granite gorge were unlike anything they had run so far. Hard rock does not yield the way softer sedimentary stone does. The river, forced through narrow passages in the schist, accelerates and drops and churns in ways that are more violent and less predictable than rapids in wider canyons. The waves are steeper. The hydraulics, the places where water folds back on itself in a recirculating curl, are stronger. A wooden boat caught in one of those hydraulics does not simply tip. It can be held there, spinning and filling with water, for longer than a man can hold his breath. Powell's method for each significant rapid was the same throughout the journey, and he applied it here with the same discipline he had applied everywhere else, though the stakes were higher and the options were fewer. He would stop the boats above the rapid, climb to a vantage point if one existed, and study the water. He was looking for the line, the path through the rapid that offered the best chance of running it cleanly. Sometimes the line was obvious, sometimes there was no good line, and the choice became whether to portage the gear and line the empty boats through on ropes, or to portage everything entirely, which meant carrying thousands of pounds of supplies over slick, broken rock along canyon walls that were not always cooperative about offering a path. And sometimes, in the Grand Canyon, the walls offered no path at all. The canyon would simply drop into the water on both sides, and the only way forward was through the rapid itself. They ran some of them, they lined others, they portaged when they could, and when they could not portage they ran rapids that, by any reasonable standard, they should not have been able to run in wooden boats with no life jackets and no rescue capability downstream. The boats were leaking by this point. The constant battering of weeks on the river had worked the joints loose, and the crew caulked them when they could with whatever was available, but the caulking did not hold well, and a boat that is taking on water in a rapid is a different problem than a boat that is not. The food was nearly gone. They were rationing flour and coffee and dried apples, and the rationing was not generous. The crew was thin and tired in the specific way that comes from sustained physical effort over a long period with insufficient food, not the dramatic exhaustion of a single hard day, but the quieter, more serious depletion that accumulates over weeks. Powell's calm during this period is one of the most documented features of the expedition. Multiple crew members wrote about it, and the accounts are consistent enough that it seems genuine rather than performed. He did not minimize the danger. He did not pretend the rapids were smaller than they were, or that the situation was better than it was. But he continued to move through each decision with a kind of methodical steadiness that the crew, by this point, had come to depend on. He was still climbing out of the canyon when he could, still taking barometric readings, still recording the geological strata in his notebook. The science had not stopped. The attention had not stopped. And there is something in that, in the fact that he was still writing things down, still measuring and naming and observing, that seems to have communicated to the crew that the expedition was still an expedition, still a purposeful thing, rather than simply a desperate attempt to get out alive. There is one moment from the Grand Canyon section of the journey that has been retold many times, and it is worth telling carefully because the details matter. Powell had climbed out onto a cliff face above a rapid to get a better view of the water below. The wall was Vishnu schist, dark, dense, with fewer handholds than the limestone and sandstone he had climbed in the upper canyons. He found a way up, but at a certain point he found himself on a ledge with no way to continue upward, and more critically, no way to reverse his path. The holds he had used to get to the ledge were not holds that worked in the other direction. He was stranded, not in immediate danger of falling, but unable to move in any direction without falling. The ledge was narrow, the drop below was serious. George Bradley was below, watching. Bradley was a former sergeant in the US Army, practical and resourceful, and he assessed the situation quickly. There was no rope immediately at hand, or at least no rope long enough to reach Powell from the top of the cliff. What Bradley did have was a pair of long woolen underwear, which he tied into a makeshift line and lowered down to Powell from above. Powell grabbed the improvised rope with his one hand, and Bradley hauled him up to safety. It is the kind of story that sounds like it might have been embellished over the years, but it appears in Bradley's own diary, written at the time, and there is no particular reason to doubt it. It is also, in a quiet way, a perfect small portrait of the expedition, the one-armed geologist stranded on a cliff face, the practical soldier improvising a rope from his underwear, and the two of them getting the thing done and moving on. Lava Falls is the rapid that most people who know anything about the Colorado River know by name. It sits near the western end of the Grand Canyon, and it is the most violent rapid on the entire river. A drop of roughly 37 feet over a very short horizontal distance, with a series of massive waves and hydraulics at the bottom that have destroyed modern fiberglass boats and thrown experienced whitewater guides out of rafts. In 1869, running it in a wooden boat was not a considered option. Powell studied it from above. The portage around Lava Falls is not easy. The basalt rock on the canyon walls is sharp and irregular, and carrying heavy boats and supplies over it is slow, exhausting work. But they portaged. The decision was not dramatic. It was simply the correct decision, and Powell made it. The lava itself is part of what makes this section of the canyon geologically striking. At various points in the canyon's history, volcanic eruptions from the rim sent lava cascading down into the gorge, and in some cases the lava dammed the river entirely, creating lakes that could have stretched for hundreds of miles upstream before the water eventually broke through. Powell recognised the lava flows for what they were and wrote about them with genuine excitement. Here was evidence of a geological drama of enormous scale. The river and the volcano locked in a contest that the river had, in the end, won. The canyon continued. The river was still there. The lava was a feature of the walls now, dark and glassy against the older schist. The crew was quieter in the Grand Canyon than they had been at the earlier point in the journey. The diary entries from this period are sparse. There was less energy for writing, less energy for observation, less energy for anything beyond the immediate work of moving the boats forward and keeping them intact. Andy Hall, who had been the youngest member of the crew and generally the most cheerful, was quiet. Jack Sumner, who had been one of the most experienced outdoorsmen on the expedition, was quiet. Walter Powell, John's brother, had been showing signs of serious psychological strain for weeks, likely the accumulated weight of his Civil War experience surfacing in the confined and stressful conditions of the canyon, and by this point he was barely functional in the ways that the expedition required. John Powell managed his brother with the same steadiness he applied to everything else, but it added a layer of difficulty that his journals do not dwell on. The river gave no comfortable signs of ending. Every morning they woke to the sound of it, and every morning they climbed into the boats and moved downstream, and every evening they stopped and ate what little there was to eat, and tried to sleep in a canyon that was still radiating the heat of the day long after the sun had left the walls. The temperature in the inner gorge in August can exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, and the dark schist absorbs and holds heat, in a way that the lighter-coloured sedimentary rock above does not. The air was hot and close and smelled of river water and wet wood. And yet Powell continued to take readings. He continued to write. His journal from this stretch of the journey is not long, but it is precise. Elevations, positions, descriptions of the rock, notes on the character of individual rapids. He was building something in those pages, even in the worst of it. A record. A first account of a place that had never had one. He understood, or seemed to understand, that the suffering of the moment was not the point of the thing. The point was what they were learning, and what they would be able to say afterward about this river and this canyon and the geological history written in its walls. What he could not yet know, what none of them could know, was how close they actually were to the end. The calculations in Powell's notebook suggested they were near, but the river did not feel near to ending. It felt like it could go on forever. The canyon walls were still high, the rapids were still coming, the food was still running out. 3 of the crew had reached a point where they had stopped believing Powell's numbers. They had decided privately that the river ahead was not survivable, and they were considering what to do about that belief. The decision they would make, and the decision Powell and the remaining men would make in response, was still a few days away, but the shape of it was forming, somewhere in the exhausted silence of the camp at night, while the river ran dark and fast through the schist, and the stars appeared in the narrow strip of sky above the gorge. The canyon was not finished with them yet. The morning of August 27th, 1869, began the way most mornings in the Grand Canyon had begun by that point, with the sound of water and the smell of damp wood, and the particular quality of light that appears in a deep canyon before the sun has crested the walls, a kind of cool, diffuse glow that makes everything look slightly unreal. The crew woke in that light, and somewhere in the camp, before the day had properly started, Orrimal Howland told John Wesley Powell that he was leaving. Orrimal Howland was not a young man making an impulsive decision. He was 36 years old, a printer and outdoorsman from Colorado, and he had been on the river since the beginning. He had been in the boat when the No-Name capsized in Lodore Canyon back in June. He had lost his maps and notes in that wreck. Months of work, gone. He had stayed anyway and kept going and made it this far. For him to say, now that he was done, meant something. It was not a small thing. He had thought about it, and he had made up his mind, and his younger brother Seneca had made the same decision, and so had Bill Dunn, the mountain man who had been one of the most capable members of the crew throughout the entire journey. The rapid that had pushed them to this point was a serious one. Powell had studied it from above the previous day, and what he had seen was not encouraging. A violent stretch of water, a large rock in the middle of the channel, and below it a series of waves that were difficult to read from any angle. The canyon walls on either side offered no easy portage route. The options were genuinely limited, and Orrimal Howland had looked at the same rapid Powell had looked at and reached a different conclusion about what it meant. What it meant to Howland, and to Dunn, and to Seneca, was that the river ahead was not survivable. They had been on this river for 99 days. They had run rapids that had broken boats, lost food, repaired and re-repaired gear that was never meant to take this kind of punishment. The flour was mostly gone. The bacon was long past eating. They had been rationing for weeks. 3 men had already left the expedition. Frank Goodman had walked away at the Uinta River in June, and whatever peace of mind had been available to the crew at that point had been slowly consumed by everything that came after. Howland had done the arithmetic in his own head, and the arithmetic said that the river would kill them before it ended. Powell's arithmetic said something different. He had been taking barometric altitude readings throughout the canyon, calculating their elevation relative to the known elevation of the lower river. His numbers told him they were close, very close, to the point where the canyon would open and the gradient would ease. He believed they had perhaps 1 or 2 more days of difficult water, and then they would be through. He had shared these calculations with the crew. Howland did not believe them, or did not trust them enough to stake his life on them, which is a different thing. Powell spent that night talking. He moved between the campfire and the riverbank, and he talked to Howland and Dunn and Seneca, quietly and at length, laying out his reasoning. He was not pleading exactly. His journals don't describe it that way. But he was trying, with everything he had, to convince 3 men to stay. He shared his notes. He walked them through the elevation calculations. He told them what he believed was waiting on the other side of the rapid. He may have acknowledged in some form that he could be wrong, though his journals are not entirely clear on this point. What they are clear on is that the conversation went on for most of the night, and that by morning nothing had changed. The 3 men had decided they would climb out of the canyon and walk overland to the nearest Mormon settlement. They believed this was the safer option. In the context of what they knew and felt and feared on the morning of August 27th, it is not hard to understand why. They had been inside a canyon for weeks, eating almost nothing, running water that had come close to killing them on multiple occasions, watching their boats deteriorate and their supplies disappear. The idea of climbing up and out, of getting above the river, above the walls, back onto solid ground under an open sky, must have felt like the only sane response to an impossible situation. Powell gave them what he could. He gave them duplicate copies of his expedition records, so that if the worst happened to him and the remaining crew, the scientific work of the journey would survive in 2 separate places. He gave them rifles, He gave them food, what little there was. The exchange was quiet and, by the accounts that survive, not angry. These were not men who hated each other. They were men who had looked at the same river and made different judgments about it, and now they were going to go their separate ways and live or die by those judgments. At dawn, the 3 men began climbing the canyon wall. Powell and the 5 who remained, Walter Powell, George Bradley, Jack Sumner, Andy Hall and Billy Hawkins, loaded the boats and prepared to run the rapid. Bradley's diary records that they watched Howland and Dunn and Seneca climbing for a while, and then they turned back to the river. The rapid took less than an hour to run. Both boats made it through. The waves were serious, and the rock in the middle of the channel was exactly where Howland had said it was. But Powell had read the line correctly, and the boats found the water they needed. On the other side, the men pulled to shore and fired their guns in the air, a signal to the 3 climbers above that they had made it. There was no answering shot. The canyon walls absorbed the sound, and the river kept moving, and Powell and his 5 men got back in the boats and continued downstream. They would later learn what happened to Oromel Howland, Seneca Howland, and Bill Dunn. The exact sequence of events is not fully known, and historians have debated the details for more than a century, but the broad outline is not disputed. The 3 men reached the rim of the canyon. They crossed the plateau, and somewhere on that crossing they were killed, almost certainly by a group of Paiute people, though the circumstances that led to the violence are genuinely unclear. One account recorded years later suggests that the 3 men may have been mistaken for a different group, possibly a group of men who had recently committed an act of violence in the area, and against whom the killing may have been understood as a form of justice. Another account suggests a simpler and more brutal explanation. The truth of it has never been definitively established. What is certain is that they died on the plateau, within a relatively short distance of the Mormon settlements they had been trying to reach. They had made it out of the canyon, they had survived the climb, and then something happened, out on the open ground above the gorge, that ended 3 lives that the river had not managed to end. Powell learned of their death sometime after the expedition concluded. He never spoke about it extensively in public. His published accounts of the journey mention the separation, describe the decision the 3 men made, and then move on. There is a restraint in the way he handles it that is hard to interpret with confidence. It could be guilt, the knowledge that his calculations had been right, that the river had been survivable, that 3 men had left and died for a fear that turned out to be unfounded. It could be something more complicated than guilt, something that doesn't have a clean name. He had spent a night trying to convince them to stay, and they had not stayed, and he had run the rapid and survived, and they had climbed the wall and died. The geometry of that is not comfortable to sit with. What makes it harder is the irony, and the irony is genuine and not small. 3 men left because they believed the river would kill them. The river did not kill them. The land above the canyon, the open plateau they had chosen as the safer option, was where they died. The 5 men who stayed in the boats, who ran the rapid that Howland had called impassable, came through it in under an hour and kept going. Powell's numbers had been right. He had been close to the end, not metaphorically close, actually close in terms of miles and days and elevation. The 3 men who left had made a rational decision based on everything they knew and felt, and the decision had been wrong, and they had paid for it in the hardest possible way. There is a historical footnote to all of this that is worth noting, and it is the kind of detail that tends to stay with you. The rapid itself, the one that prompted the separation, the one that Howland believed was impassable, the one that Powell and the remaining crew ran in less than an hour, was named Separation Rapid. It sits in the western Grand Canyon, in the stretch of river below Lava Falls, and it was a serious rapid for a long time. It is now submerged beneath the waters of Lake Mead. The reservoir that was created by Hoover Dam in the 1930s flooded the lower end of the Grand Canyon and covered Separation Rapid entirely. The place where the expedition nearly ended, the place where 3 men made the decision that would cost them their lives, is underwater now, and has been for decades. You cannot go there. You cannot stand on the bank and look at the water and try to understand what they saw. It is gone. Powell did not write extensively about the emotional weight of the separation in his journals, but George Bradley did, at least briefly. Bradley's diary entry for August 28th, the day after the three men left, the day the remaining crew ran the rapid and continued downstream, is one of the more affecting documents from the entire expedition. He wrote that the loss of the three men weighed heavily on all of them. He wrote that he hoped they would make it to safety. He did not yet know that they would not. He wrote that the river ahead seemed, for the first time in weeks, to be easing. The canyon walls were beginning to drop. The gradient was gentling. Powell's calculations, it was becoming clear, had been correct. The remaining 5 men were exhausted in a way that is hard to fully convey. They had been on the river for 99 days. They had eaten almost nothing for the past week. Their clothes were rotting. The boats were leaking badly enough that bailing had become a near constant task. Walter Powell was in poor shape psychologically, and the others were not far behind him in terms of sheer depletion. But they were still moving, and the canyon was changing around them, and Powell was still at the front of the Emma Dean, still reading the water ahead, still doing the thing he had been doing since May. There is something worth sitting with in that image for a moment. A one-armed man in a leaking wooden boat at the end of 99 days of the most difficult river travel ever attempted in North America, still watching the water, still taking notes, still navigating, not triumphant, not dramatic, just continuing. The expedition had been, from the beginning, an act of sustained attention, the kind of attention that does not stop when it becomes difficult, that does not stop when the food runs out or the boats break or 3 men climb out of the canyon and disappear into the plateau above. Powell's particular quality, the thing that made him capable of this journey, was not courage in the theatrical sense. It was something quieter, a willingness to keep looking at the thing in front of him, whatever that thing was, and to keep trying to understand it. The canyon walls ahead of them were lower now. The sound of the river had changed, and somewhere downstream, though none of them knew exactly where or when, the Grand Canyon was about to give them back to the world. What waited for them there, and what the world would make of what they had done, was still just out of sight, around the next bend in a river that had been full of next bends for 3 months. But they were close. Powell's numbers had been right all along, and then, on August 29th, 1869, the canyon ended. Not dramatically, not with a sudden opening of sky or a rush of clear water into a calm lake. It ended the way most things end after a very long time, gradually, and then all at once. The walls dropped. The granite gave way to softer stone. The river widened. The light came in from a lower angle, and there was more of it. Powell and the 5 remaining men rounded a curve in the river and found themselves looking at a landscape that was not a canyon. The Grand Wash Cliffs, the western boundary of the Grand Canyon, a great escarpment of pale stone marking where the plateau finally steps down toward the Mojave, rose to the north, and beyond them was open sky, and the river ahead ran smooth and broad and unhurried, as though it had forgotten entirely what it had just been doing for the past 3 months. They had been on the river for 99 days. The first sign that the world still existed came in the form of a small group of people on the riverbank. A Mormon settler named Asa, along with members of his family, was waiting for them with food. This was not an accident. Brigham Young, who had heard about the expedition and had apparently been following its progress with some interest, had sent word to settlements along the lower river to watch for the party. Asa had been checking the river for days, not entirely sure anyone would actually appear. And then, coming around the bend in 4 battered wooden boats, they did. Powell and his men pulled to shore. The boats were in poor condition. The Emma Dean had taken on so much water over the final days that keeping her moving had required constant effort. The men themselves were in roughly the same state. They had been eating almost nothing for a week. Their clothing was in tatters. George Bradley, who had kept his diary more faithfully than anyone else on the expedition, noted that when they finally landed, he felt something he could not quite name. Not joy exactly, not relief exactly, something more like the slow return of a feeling he had forgotten he was supposed to have. They ate. Asa's family had brought food, and Powell and his men ate, and that is one of those simple details that sits in the historical record without much commentary, but carries a great deal of weight if you let it. 99 days. Roughly 1,000 miles of river, much of it through canyon walls so high that the sky was a narrow strip of blue far above their heads. And at the end of it, food. Prepared by strangers who had been asked to wait for them by a man who had bet, apparently correctly, that they would come through. 3 of the original 10 men were not there. Frank Goodman had left weeks earlier at the Winter River Agency, the first departure, his nerve gone after the capsize of the No-Name in Lodore Canyon. Oramal Howland, Seneca Howland, and Bill Dunn had left 2 days before, climbing out of the canyon at Separation Rapid. Powell did not speak of them at length in those first hours. Bradley's diary does not record what was said, if anything, about the 3 men who were missing. There was probably very little to say. Powell had spent a night trying to convince them to stay. They had not stayed. Whether news of their fate had reached Powell yet is unclear. It likely had not in those first hours on the lower river. That knowledge would come later. What Powell had, in those first moments after landing, was the expedition itself. The physical fact of it. The journals, the scientific notes, the altitude readings, the stratigraphic observations, the named canyons and rivers and formations. The barometers, one original, one repaired after the loss of the others in Lodore Canyon, had been carried the entire length of the river and had produced a continuous record of elevation change. The sextant readings had given Powell a rough but usable set of longitude and latitude measurements for key points along the route. He had named dozens of geographic features: Desolation Canyon, Cataract Canyon, Glen Canyon, Marble Canyon, the Escalante River. He had recorded the geological strata in the canyon walls in more detail than anyone had ever done before, identifying rock layers that range from the Permian limestone near the canyon rim down through the Carboniferous, the Devonian, the Cambrian, and finally into the Vishnu schist of the inner gorge, rock that was 1.7 billion years old, older than almost anything exposed at the surface anywhere on Earth. He had, in a very real sense, read the canyon. The walls had been telling a story, and Powell had been one of the very few people alive who could hear it, and he had listened, carefully, for 3 months. The crew dispersed quietly after the landing. There was no ceremony, no formal conclusion to the expedition. Jack Sumner and Andy Hall continued downriver toward Fort Yuma, apparently not quite ready to stop moving. George Bradley made his way toward home. Walter Powell, John's brother, who had been in poor psychological condition for much of the latter half of the journey, travelled with John for a time. The expedition had not ended with a celebration because there was no one to celebrate with, and because the men themselves were too depleted for anything like celebration. They had survived. That was the thing. That was the whole of it. Powell travelled to Salt Lake City. From there, he sent a telegram. The telegram was necessary because by that point, the expedition had been reported dead. The press had gotten hold of the story sometime in August, after the crew had been in the canyon for weeks without any word reaching the outside world. A man named John Risdon had appeared in Salt Lake City claiming to be a survivor of the Powell expedition, saying the party had been destroyed in the canyon, all hands lost. The story was printed in several newspapers. It was not true. Risdon appears to have had no connection to the expedition whatsoever, but it spread, and by the time Powell emerged from the canyon, a number of newspapers had already published obituaries or disaster reports. The Chicago Tribune ran the story. The New York Times picked it up. The expedition was dead. Powell was dead. The Grand Canyon had claimed them all, and then the telegram arrived. The reaction was significant, though it took a little time to build. Powell was not yet a famous man, and the expedition had not yet been given the shape it would eventually take in the public imagination. But the news spread that a one-armed geology professor from Illinois had led a crew of 9 men down the last unmapped river in the continental United States, through the Grand Canyon, and had come out the other side alive, with notebooks full of scientific observations. And the reaction was one of genuine public astonishment. Not the manufactured astonishment of a press campaign, but actual surprise that such a thing had been done, and done successfully, by a man who had lost his arm at Shiloh 7 years before, and had apparently decided that this was not a reason to stop doing things. The scientific community's response was more measured, as it tends to be, but it was real. Powell's observations from the canyon were unlike anything that had been produced before. The geological record he had assembled was detailed and careful, and covered a stretch of river that no trained scientist had ever travelled. The altitude measurements gave the first accurate picture of the canyon's depth and the river's gradient. The geographic naming he had done, working quickly, often from a boat in difficult water, would prove largely durable. Most of the names Powell gave to features of the canyon and the surrounding plateau are still in use today. What is worth pausing on for a moment is what the expedition had actually accomplished in terms of the blank space on the map. In 1869, the American West was still being mapped. Large portions of it were known only through indigenous knowledge, through the accounts of trappers and traders, through rough surveys done from a distance. The Colorado River below the Grand Canyon was, in a very specific sense, the last major river system in the continental United States that had not been travelled and documented by American surveyors. Powell's expedition closed that gap. After August 29, 1869, there was no longer a blank space where the Grand Canyon had been. There was a river, named and measured and recorded, with canyon walls described in geological terms that anyone with the right training could read. That is not a small thing. It is easy, from a distance of 150 years, to underestimate what it meant to have that blank space filled in. Maps are not just practical documents. They are, in a sense, the shape of what a society knows about the world it inhabits. For the United States in 1869, the Grand Canyon had been a rumour, a guess, a source of speculation and occasional fear. Explorers had looked down into it from the rim and decided not to try the river. The Ives expedition in 1857 had reached the canyon by boat from the lower end, travelling partway up the river, but had not attempted the full passage. Powell's crew had done the thing that no one had managed to do before, and they had done it with instruments and notebooks and a geologist at the bow, and the result was knowledge. Specific, detailed, verifiable knowledge, where before there had been only a question mark. Powell himself, in those first days after the landing, did not seem particularly interested in the drama of what had just happened. He was interested in the notes. He was already thinking about what the observations meant, about what the canyon walls were telling him about the age of the landscape, about the way the river had cut downward through the rock as the plateau slowly rose, about the concept he would later formalize as base-level erosion, the idea that a river cuts down toward a base level and that the canyon was the record of that cutting, written in stone over an incomprehensible span of time. His mind was already moving forward, from the expedition toward the science, from the experience toward what could be made of it. The crew, for their part, had done something extraordinary and received very little for it. Most of them returned to ordinary lives. Jack Sumner worked as a trapper and guide for years, and in later life felt, apparently with some bitterness, that Powell had not given the crew sufficient credit for what they had accomplished together. George Bradley went back to his life in New England. Andy Hall, the youngest member of the crew, was killed by Apache raiders in Arizona in 1882, 13 years after the expedition, while working as a freight driver. Orrimal Howland, Seneca Howland and Bill Dunn had been dead since late August, killed on the plateau above the canyon 2 days after leaving the expedition. The exact circumstances still disputed more than a century and a half later. Powell would go on. That much is clear from the beginning. The expedition was not the end of anything for him. It was, in a sense, the opening of a much longer project. The scientific work he had started in the canyon would take decades to fully develop. The questions the canyon had raised about the age of the landscape, about the relationship between rivers and the rock they cut through, about what the West was and what it could support and what it could not, would occupy the rest of his career, and the answers he arrived at would turn out to matter in ways that extended well beyond geology. But that is the next part of the story. What matters here, in this moment, is the simpler fact of the landing. August 29th, 1869. 5 men in 4 battered boats pulling to shore at the Grand Wash Cliffs. A Mormon settler and his family waiting with food on the bank. The canyon behind them, the open desert ahead. The river running quiet and wide in the late summer light. 99 days, 1,000 miles, as the last blank space on the American map now filled in. Powell stepped out of the Emma Dean onto the bank. He had one arm. He had a notebook full of observations. He had run the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, and he was alive, and the world was about to find out what he had seen. What he would do with that knowledge, and what the country would eventually do with the river itself, was already beginning to take shape, in the way that things do, quietly, just out of sight. Powell returned to Washington in the autumn of 1869 a changed man, though perhaps not in the ways one might expect. He was not celebrated immediately. There was no parade, no formal reception, no official government acknowledgement of what he had done. The press had already written the expedition off as a disaster, and when news arrived that Powell and 5 men had survived, the reaction was more surprise than triumph. He gave some lectures, he wrote some letters, and then, with the quiet focus that seemed to define him, he began preparing to go back. The second Colorado River expedition launched in 1871 and continued into 1872, and it was a very different undertaking from the first. Powell had learned from the 1869 journey what he needed and what he had lacked. This time there were photographers, E.O. Beeman and later James Fenimore and John Hillers, who produced some of the earliest photographs ever taken of the canyon landscape. There was a more systematic approach to the scientific recording, with dedicated crew members assigned to specific measurements. The boats were better. The food supply was more carefully managed. Powell himself ran only part of the river in this second expedition, leaving and rejoining the crew at various points, climbing out of the canyon to conduct overland surveys of the surrounding plateau country. The 1871 journey was in many ways more thorough than the 1869 one, precisely because Powell already knew what was down there and could plan around it. But it is the 1869 expedition that history remembers, and probably rightly so. The second journey was more organised, more comfortable, more scientifically rigorous in some respects. The first was the one done in the dark, with borrowed instruments, and uncertain food, and no knowledge of what the next bend in the river would bring. The 1871 expedition produced better photographs. The 1869 expedition produced the knowledge that made the photographs possible. Powell's great written work from this period was published in 1875, a document titled Exploration of the Colorado River of the West and its Tributaries. It is a remarkable piece of writing, and not only for the scientific content. Powell was a good writer, clear, precise, and occasionally genuinely beautiful in his descriptions of the landscape. The report drew on journals from both expeditions, and it laid out in careful detail the geological structure of the canyon system, the relationships between the river and the rock, the way the plateau had risen slowly while the river cut steadily downward, keeping its course by eroding faster than the land could lift. He described the canyon walls in terms of their geological ages, walking the reader through hundreds of millions of years of Earth history in the space of a few pages. It was the foundational document of American canyon geology, and it remained the authoritative account of the Colorado River system for decades. He coined terms in that report that are still used today: base level, the theoretical lowest point to which a river can erode, determined by the elevation of the body of water it flows into, is a Powell concept. He worked out the mechanics of it from what he'd observed in the canyon, the way the river had cut precisely as deep as it needed to and no deeper, the way the canyon walls preserved the record of that cutting in their exposed layers. He was doing something that felt almost philosophical in a way. He was reading time in rock and then finding the language to explain what he had read. That is not a simple thing to do, and the fact that he did it while recovering from a journey that had nearly killed him, and several of the men with him, says something about the particular quality of his attention. His career after the expedition moved steadily toward institutional power, which is not always where explorers end up, but which, in Powell's case, seemed almost inevitable. He was appointed director of the US Geological Survey in 1881, a position he held until 1894. Under his direction, the survey produced systematic topographic maps of the entire United States, a massive methodical project that transformed the country's understanding of its own geography. He also directed the Bureau of American Ethnology, which he had helped found, and which produced detailed studies of Native American languages and cultures across the West. Powell had spent enough time in the canyon country and in contact with the people who had lived there for centuries to understand that the landscape and its human history were not separate subjects. The geology and the people and the water were all part of the same story. But the work that may have mattered most in the long run was a report he published in 1878, 5 years before he became director of the Geological Survey, at a moment when he had enough credibility to be heard, but not yet enough institutional authority to be dismissed as merely political. It was called Report on the Lands of the Arid Region of the United States, and it was, in the plainest possible terms, a warning. Powell had travelled the West. He had walked it and rode it and climbed it. He had spent years looking at the land with the careful eye of a geologist, and what he saw was a landscape that was fundamentally structurally dry. The 100th meridian, roughly the line that runs through the middle of the Great Plains, from North Dakota down through Texas, was, in Powell's analysis, the boundary between the humid East and the arid West. East of that line, rainfall was generally sufficient to support conventional farming without irrigation. West of it, with a few exceptions, it was not. The West received on average less than 20 inches of rain per year across most of its area. Large portions of it received far less. The Colorado River Basin, the Great Basin, the Sonoran Desert. These were not places that could be farmed the way Illinois or Ohio could be farmed. They required a different approach entirely. Powell's recommendation was specific and, for the era, genuinely radical. He argued that the West should be organised around its watersheds, that land should be allocated in units defined by water access, not by the rectangular grid survey system that the federal government had been using since the Land Ordinance of 1785. He proposed that irrigation districts should be established cooperatively, with water rights tied to the land and managed collectively, rather than claimed individually. He suggested that large portions of the arid West simply should not be farmed at all, at least not in the conventional sense, and that the carrying capacity of the land for grazing was far lower than the boosterish promoters of Western settlement were claiming. The report was not well received. This is putting it mildly. The 1870s and 1880s were a period of aggressive Western expansion, of railroad companies and land speculators and territorial boosters, all competing to attract settlers to the West, with promises of fertile land and reliable rainfall. There was a popular theory at the time, not a scientific theory, but a widely repeated claim, that rain followed the plough, meaning that the act of farming and settling the land would itself increase rainfall, that cultivation would somehow change the climate of the arid regions and make them wetter. Powell thought this was nonsense, and he said so, carefully and with data. Congress was not interested. The boosters were not interested. The settlers who were already moving west were not interested. Powell's report was largely set aside. He was right, of course. The history of water in the American West over the following century and a half is in many ways the history of ignoring John Wesley Powell. The Homestead Act drew settlers onto land that could not support them without irrigation. The great droughts of the 1930s, the Dust Bowl, devastated the plains exactly as Powell might have predicted, the result of farming land that had never been suited to it. The Colorado River was dammed and diverted and allocated among 7 states in a compact signed in 1922 during an unusually wet period, with water rights assigned based on flow measurements that turned out to be higher than the river's long-term average. The West was built on water assumptions that Powell had specifically warned against, and the consequences of those assumptions are still unfolding. And then there is the matter of the lake. Glen Canyon Dam was completed in 1966 across the Colorado River in northern Arizona, just upstream from the Grand Canyon. The reservoir it created, stretching back nearly 200 miles into Utah, was named Lake Powell. It flooded Glen Canyon, the place that John Wesley Powell had described in his 1875 report as the most beautiful landscape he had ever seen. The hanging gardens, the smooth red sandstone walls, the clear side streams, the music temple where the crew had sung, all of it went underwater. The lake that bears his name covers the canyon that he loved most. There is a particular kind of irony in that, and it is the kind that is hard to know exactly how to hold. Powell did not build the dam. He had been dead for 64 years by the time the reservoir filled. He could not have anticipated that the federal water infrastructure he had, in a complicated way, helped make possible through his geological surveys and his institutional work at the USGS, would eventually be used to flood the canyon he had named and written about with such care. The dam was built by the Bureau of Reclamation, an agency whose existence and whose approach to Western water management represented, in some ways, the triumph of the philosophy Powell had argued against. The idea that engineering could solve the West's water problem, that rivers could be stored and redirected and managed on a large enough scale to support the population and agriculture that the arid land would not naturally sustain. Lake Powell is, depending on who you ask, either a remarkable feat of engineering or a cautionary monument to a century of decisions Powell himself had warned against. It is probably both. The reservoir provides water and power to millions of people in the Southwest. It also sits, in recent years, at dramatically low levels, the result of prolonged drought and overallocation of the river's water, the exact conditions Powell had described as inevitable if the West was developed without regard for its actual water supply. In 2022, the reservoir dropped to its lowest level since it was first filled, exposing canyon walls and submerged features that had not been visible in decades. The houseboat marinas sat far above the waterline. The bathtub ring of the white mineral deposits on the canyon walls marked how far the water had fallen. Powell had looked at the Colorado River in 1869 and seen, with unusual clarity, what it was and what it was not. It was a powerful river, capable of cutting through 2 billion years of rock and carving one of the great geological features on Earth. It was not an infinite resource. It ran through one of the driest landscapes in North America, fed by snowmelt from the Rockies, and its flow was variable and, in the long term, limited. He understood this not as a pessimistic observation, but as a practical one, the beginning of a realistic conversation about how the West could be used and what it could sustain. That conversation largely did not happen. The decisions got made differently, and the river got divided up and dammed and drawn down, and the lake that bears his name is now one of the clearest illustrations of the problem he spent the second half of his life trying to describe. He resigned from the U.S. Geological Survey in 1894 under pressure, after years of conflict with Congress over funding and over his insistence on careful, methodical science in an era when political interests often wanted faster, more convenient answers. He spent his last years writing and thinking, and he died in 1902 at his summer cottage in Haven, Maine, at the age of 68. His arm had been bothering him for years. The nerve damage from the original wound at Shiloh had never fully healed, and he suffered periodic pain from it throughout his life. He died, by most accounts, quietly. What he left behind was substantial. The topographic maps, the geological surveys, the ethnographic studies, the report on the arid lands, the 1875 account of the Colorado River. And underneath all of it, the expedition itself, 99 days on the river, 5 men and 4 boats emerging from the canyon at the Grand Wash Cliffs on a late August morning, carrying notebooks full of observations about a landscape no American surveyor had ever fully seen. The expedition had been, among other things, an act of sustained attention. Powell had looked at the canyon walls and seen time. He had looked at the river and understood, in a way that very few people in 1869 were equipped to understand, what it was doing and how long it had been doing it. He had looked at the West and seen, with uncomfortable clarity, the limits of what it could offer and the conditions under which those limits would eventually make themselves felt. Not everyone wanted to hear that, but he kept saying it, in report after report, in lecture after lecture, in the patient and precise language of a man who had spent months in a canyon reading rock and come out the other side with something important to say. The shadow of the 1869 expedition falls across all of it, across the science, across the warnings, across the lake that now covers the canyon he loved. It is the thing that gave Powell the authority to speak and the knowledge to know what he was speaking about. Without those 99 days on the river, without the leather strap around his stump and the barometer readings and the notebook filling up with geological observations as the canyon walls rose around him, none of the rest of it would have been possible. The expedition was the beginning of a much longer project, and the project is, in certain important ways, still unfinished. The questions Powell was asking about the West, about water, about limits, about what the land can and cannot support, are still being asked with increasing urgency by people who are now living with the consequences of the answers that were chosen instead of his. Which brings us in the end to the canyon itself, and to what it means that we can still go there and stand at the rim and look down into it, and to what the river is doing now, and what Powell would make of all of it if he could see it. That is where the story finally comes to rest. The Grand Canyon receives around 6 million visitors a year. That number is almost too large to picture. On a busy summer day, the South Rim is crowded with people from every part of the world, standing at overlooks, taking photographs, watching the light change on the rock. And yet, for all of that, the canyon itself remains largely untouched by human presence. You can walk to the rim and look down and see almost exactly what Powell saw from the river below. The same layers of limestone and sandstone and schist, the same colours shifting from buff to red to deep grey as the walls descend. The same quality of silence that seems to rise out of the depth itself. The canyon is too large and too steep and too far from easy water to be lived in at any scale. It absorbs 6 million visitors a year and barely shows it. That is not a small thing. The Colorado River, though, is a different story. The river Powell spent 99 days on, the one that cut those walls over millions of years, carrying sediment from the Rockies to the Gulf of California. That river no longer reliably reaches the sea. It hasn't most years since the 1960s. The water is drawn off upstream, divided among 7 states and Mexico by a legal framework called the Colorado River Compact, agreed upon in 1922, which allocated more water than the river actually carries in an average year. That mistake, and it was a mistake, made partly because the compact was negotiated during an unusually wet period, and partly because the negotiators were working with incomplete data, has been accumulating consequences ever since. The river now ends most years in a shallow mudflat in the Sonoran Desert, miles short of the Gulf. What was once a broad delta, rich with cottonwood forests and wildlife, is now largely dry. The water that built the canyon over 2 billion years of erosion no longer completes its journey. Powell would not have been surprised. He would have been saddened, probably, but not surprised. He had looked at the river and the landscape around it with the careful eyes of someone who understood systems, who understood that a river is not just water moving through a channel, but a whole set of relationships between precipitation and elevation and geology and time. He had said as clearly as he could say it that the West water was limited and that the demands being placed on it would eventually exceed the supply. He had proposed a different way of organising settlement in the arid lands, smaller community-managed irrigation districts, boundaries drawn along watersheds rather than the grid of the land survey, governance structures that matched the actual shape of the land and its resources. It was, for the 1870s and 1880s, a genuinely radical idea. It went nowhere. What happened instead is what you can see now. If you look at the river and the reservoirs and the cities that have grown up in the desert southwest over the past century, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Tucson, Los Angeles drawing water from hundreds of miles away through aqueducts, agriculture in the Imperial Valley, one of the driest places in North America, irrigated to produce a significant portion of the country's winter vegetables. All of it sustained by the river Powell floated down in wooden boats, divided and stored and moved according to agreements that are now being renegotiated, with difficulty as the water runs shorter and the climate shifts and the snowpack in the Rockies, the source of most of the river's flow, becomes less reliable year by year. None of this diminishes what Powell did. If anything, it makes it more remarkable. He came down that river with a sextant and a barometer and a notebook, with one arm and a crew of 9 men who had never done anything like this before, and he came out the other side with a clearer understanding of the landscape and its limits than the institutions that came after him would manage for decades. He was a geologist by training and a surveyor by practice, but what he brought to the canyon was something harder to name, a kind of patient, structured curiosity, a willingness to look at what was actually there rather than what people hoped was there. The West in 1869 was still being imagined as a land of unlimited possibility, and Powell was one of the first people with the knowledge and the standing to say, carefully and with evidence, that the imagination was outrunning the reality. There is something worth sitting with in the image of him on the river. A 35-year-old man with one arm, climbing canyon walls with a leather strap looped around his stump, taking barometric readings at the top and writing down what he saw. The walls rising around him, 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet, 3,000 feet of rock, each layer a different colour and a different age, the whole thing a record of time so deep it is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind, and Powell looking at it not with awe that stopped him in his tracks, though he clearly felt that too, but with the specific attention of someone who wanted to understand what he was seeing. He named the formations, he measured the altitudes, he wrote down the colours and the textures and the angles of the strata. He was doing science, but he was also doing something that looks, from this distance, like a form of respect, taking the canyon seriously enough to try to know it, rather than just to pass through it. The men who left, Orrimal Howland, Seneca Howland, Bill Dunn, walked out of the canyon on the morning of August 28th, 1869, and were dead within days. Powell and the 5 men who stayed ran the rapid and were through it in less than an hour. He never fully reckoned with that, at least not in public. He wrote about the separation in his published account, but with a restraint that tells you something about how much he was holding back. He had spent a night trying to convince them to stay. He had shared his calculations, told them he believed the end was close. They didn't believe him, or they didn't trust the river, or they had simply reached the limit of what they could endure. He was right about the distance, and they were dead, and he lived for another 33 years carrying that knowledge. It is one of the quieter, heavier parts of the story. The expedition ended on August 29th at the Grand Wash Cliffs, where the canyon opens out and the river spreads into calmer water. A Mormon settler named Asa and his family were waiting with food. Powell sent a telegram from Salt Lake City. The press had already reported the entire party dead. When the news came through that they had survived, it spread quickly, and Powell became, almost overnight, a figure of some national attention, the one-armed professor who had gone down the unknown river and come back out. He handled the attention with a certain quiet competence. He went back in 1871 with a better-equipped second expedition. He wrote the report. He took the job at the Geological Survey. He kept working. What he had done in 1869 was not just explore a river. He had produced the first real, systematic knowledge of the last unmapped region in the continental United States. He had named dozens of geographic features that still carry the names he gave them. He had recorded the stratigraphy of the canyon walls in a way that would inform geological understanding for generations. He had demonstrated that the river could be navigated, which was not a small thing at a time when serious people believed it might simply disappear underground or drop off a cliff into nothing. And he had done it with borrowed instruments, almost no money, a crew assembled from veterans and mountain men and one teenager, and 4 wooden boats, one of which was lost in the first week. There is a version of this story that turns Powell into a monument, the great explorer, the conquering hero, the man who tamed the canyon. That version is not quite right, and Powell himself would probably have found it uncomfortable. He didn't tame anything. The canyon is not tameable. The river is not tameable, as the people managing the Colorado River Compact are now discovering in ways that are increasingly difficult to manage around. What Powell did was pay attention, carefully and at length, to something that had been there for 2 billion years before he arrived, and will be there long after every dam on the river has silted up or been removed. He looked at the canyon walls and saw time. He looked at the river and saw a system with limits. He looked at the west and saw a landscape that required a different kind of imagination than the one Americans were bringing to it. He was not always right about everything, no one is, but on the things that mattered most, the things that are now most urgently relevant, he was right in ways that are hard to argue with. The canyon is still there. The river is still running, diminished but not gone. If you stand at the south rim on a clear evening and watch the light move across the walls, the way the shadows deepen in the side canyons, the way the colours shift from orange to red to purple as the sun goes down, it is easy to understand why Powell wrote about it the way he did. It is easy to understand why the crew sang a music temple, their voices rising into a natural amphitheatre carved by a side stream over thousands of years. It is easy to understand why one-armed geology professor from Illinois, with every reason to turn back, kept going. There is something in that persistence that feels worth carrying with you. Not the heroic version of it, not the monument version, but the plain human version. A person who had a question and went to find out the answer, and paid close enough attention to what he found that the knowledge he brought back still matters. That is not a small thing either. Thank you for spending this time here, following Powell down the river and through the canyon and out the other side. These stories take a long time to tell properly, and the fact that you stayed with it, whether you listened through the night or drifted in and out of sleep with the narration in the background, means a great deal. If this felt like time well spent, a like on the video helps more than you might think, and subscribing to Life Beyond Seen means you will be here for the next story, wherever it takes us. For now, wherever you are, whether it is late and quiet, or early and still dark, or somewhere in the comfortable middle of a night that has no particular urgency to it, rest well. The canyon will be there in the morning, and so will the river, still moving through all of that ancient stone, still doing what it has always done.